Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Luffy Fanfics. Back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Luffy Cursed by Paramecia Time Fruit. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Luffy was many things. Excitable. A glutton. A boy made of joy that rivaled the sun itself. Loyal until it broke his heart, everything all at once. What Luffy wasn't, however, was a child. The last time Shanks had checked, Luffy was an emperor of the sea, had beaten Kaido and was also a 19-year-old boy. Not the 7-year-old he saw in front of him now. The first mate of the Straw Hat Pirates stood behind their deeged captain, a fierce protectiveness curling his shoulders forward as he glared at Shanks. Not that it bothered the red-haired man. He could sympathize, even. He had expected the next time he would see Luffy was when the boy had become Pirate King and had promptly defeated Shanks. Not this. Luffy blinked up at him, his eyes red from crying. He was timid as he stepped forward and grasped Shanks' pant leg. Shanks had known Luffy when he was this size. And while he might have been a crybaby, he had never been this quiet. Luffy sent a weary glance at his crew before regarding Shanks. Where's Makino? Because this Luffy was clearly not the Luffy he saw in wanted posters, Shanks dropped to his knees. He disregarded the crack that resounded. She's in the East Blue, Luffy. In the Goa Kingdom. Luffy's hand sought out the straw hat on his head, the beginnings of tears manifesting along the edges of his vision. What happened? He was looking at Luffy but directed it towards the Straw Hats, who stood aboard the Red Force with an awkward air to them. It was Luffy who answered, however. I don't know. I was with Gramps, and suddenly, there were sparks everywhere. It was really bright, Luffy hiccuped. Now that Shanks got a closer look at Luffy, he could see the eye bags that were carved into his features. Luffy was naturally adventurous as a child, but being thrown 12 years into the future in the new world, surrounded by strangers, must have been difficult. And then I was with Sword Guy. There was a grumble as Zoro said, "My name is Zoro, and for the last time, you're our captain." Luffy blew his tongue at the man. I wouldn't have such a meanie on my crew. There was a collective sigh from his crew, and Shanks laughed. He had forgotten how childish Luffy was. Holding Luffy, he pulled the boy up with him and settled him in his one arm. Luffy practically melted into the embrace, exhaustion clinging to his small frame. So, what happened? He directed it towards Zoro. He had heard tales of the man from Mihawk. His skills were only rivaled by the greatest, and therefore, he was not somebody to take lightly. But that wasn't the matter at hand. Shanks had a de-aged no, displaced Luffy in his arms, where an emperor should have been leading his crew. Zoro's gaze drifted back to his crew before inspecting the men of Shanks' crew behind him. Yasopp was noticeably absent. It's just like Luffy said. Except, he winced. There was a devil fruit user. Nico Robin stepped forward, her stare fixed on Luffy, who curled closer to Shanks. Truthfully, there was no need for us to seek you out. She trailed off, gesturing with her hands. Luffy watched her, fingers clutching at the white fabric of Shanks' shirt. The effect should only last a week. However, Luffy became restless and was begging to return home. But we couldn't do that, so we brought him to the closest person he remembered. I hope you don't mind. Luffy began to climb Shanks, sitting across his shoulders and resting his head on Shanks' hair. Shanks knocked back the straw hat from Luffy's head and ruffled his hair. No, it's fine, really. Finding the face that curled close to him absolutely adorable, he pinched his cheeks. His hand fell back to his side. Robin smiled, stepping closer to rub Luffy's back in comfort. It was an awkward position, but she managed. He's not so nervous around the entire crew, but I imagine for a 7-year-old, being met with a skeleton has jarred him. From the back, there was shuffling as Brook, the crew's musician, hummed guiltily. Our swordsman is especially annoyed. Robin laughed, coaxing Luffy into her arms like one would a kitten. Luffy went willingly. Luffy is terrified of him. There was a bark of protest. Luffy won't even get my name right. Nami smacked the back of Zoro's skull, shaking her head. Really, Zoro? Scaring our de-aged captain is a new low for you. Nami whispered, smirking as she watched Zoro's face become red with agitation. Usopp joined her, an index finger in the air as he talked. I mean, we know you're a brute, but to— Zoro promptly smacked the hilt of Enma against Usopp's head. Shanks was too distracted with Luffy to pay attention, however. Beckman strolled over, and upon noticing him, Luffy cheered. Beckman smiled before regarding his captain with a sober look. Luffy and his crew can remain at our side while Luffy is incapacitated, Shanks said, nodding as Luffy found his way back to Shanks' awaiting arm. Robin pouted at the loss of contact from her small captain. Won't that be troublesome? Luffy is still an emperor. I'm sure the world government won't be happy to hear of two emperors meeting like this. Robin ped her head to the side, smiling as she watched Luffy tug back his straw hat, the sheer size of it swamping his head. Shanks shrugged, let them be worried. He eyed Luffy's crew with a smile. Come, friends of Luffy are friends of mine. Let's eat. Food? Luffy bounded out of his arm, his small but nimble legs making a break for the kitchens. After all, he was still familiar with the Red Force. Sanji, you have to cook. Sanji shoved past Zoro and smiled down at his captain. Oh, yeah? Luffy nodded, twisting to give Shanks his puppy dog eyes that Shanks recalled vividly. It would seem he was just as weak to them as he was 12 years ago. Of course, I'm sure Lucky Roo won't mind. Sanji smiled, trailing after his overexcited captain with warmth laced in his only revealed eye. Still beside Shanks, Robin frowned. Shanks noticed it from the corner of his eyes. I'm worried about Luffy. Shanks waved the comment off, he'll be fine. It may have been a while since I've seen him, but I do remember Luffy as resilient if nothing else. Robin sighed. No, you misunderstand me. Near them, Zoro and Jinbei were huddling close and evidently listening in on their conversation. This Luffy will be fine, but I have reason to suspect that the devil fruit user we came across was not a de-aging power, but a time-traveling ability. Shanks hummed, his eyebrows twisting together as he contemplated her words. Which means, our Luffy was sent back 12 years, Robin concluded, her hands fidgeting as she finally spoke her theory aloud. There was a resounding silence. Shanks exhaled before planting his only remaining arm on the woman's shoulder. For now, we eat. There's nothing we can do about the past. Even if the thought of Luffy stuck in the past for an entire week worried him greatly. Luffy's eyes stung with the effort it took to open them. He was met with a blinding flash of light, the glow of it dimming the more he blankly squinted at it. Beneath him, the grass was sharp and dug into his back. Coughing, Luffy heaved and gasped, twisting to hold himself up as he tried to gain footing in his new location. He had a second to recall the memories of what happened before he was swiftly moved into the air by the nape of his shirt. Groggily, Luffy stared down at the massive figure in front of him. Being held like a kitten, dangling in the air was familiar to Luffy. A sense of déjà vu washed over him, as he gazed down at a noticeably younger Monkey D. Garp. Luffy's grandfather. What the, Garp mumbled, moving Luffy so that he could inspect him like one would with a newspaper. You look like Luffy, but you're not Luffy, Garp concluded, dropping the teenager to the ground in a fit of agitation. Luffy coughed, not quite feeling like himself, as he shakily stood to his feet, his sandals digging into the ground. Gramps? Luffy muttered, fists clenching and unclenching as he attempted to gather his bearings. Mind still fogged, his hands unconsciously sought out the straw hat atop his head, finding it still sat snugly upon his tangled mop of black hair. Garp was staring at him, his head ped in wonder as he pondered the situation. Luffy could sympathize. What did you do now, brat? Garp questioned, one bushy eyebrow raised in alarm. Clad in jorts, similar to Luffy's and an orange and red Hawaiian shirt, he looked ridiculous. And like he was on vacation. The last time Luffy had heard, Garp hadn't been on vacation since Ace's death. The wrinkles that adorned Garp's face were lesser than the amount he had when Luffy had last seen him. Something wasn't adding up. Luffy shrugged it off. Luffy tilted his head, unknowingly copying his grandfather as he spoke. I was fighting a devil fruit user, then, Luffy shrugged, I guess I got teleported here. Luffy regarded the clearing they were in, hesitant. It was vast, with trees surrounding them like a cage, their trunks grand and thick. Luffy had seen similar trees before, all the way back on Dawn Island. Of course, he couldn't be there, though, as he was in the New World. Wherever, here, is. Garp was huffing, boots slapping against the ground as he began to pace. Here is Dawn Island, brat. Luffy's eyes widened comically as he stared at his grandfather. His knees buckled under the weight of the revelation. The Marine was too busy to acknowledge his grandson's crisis on the ground. Luffy was on Dawn Island. To reach his crew he would have to travel the East Blue, navigate Reverse Mountain and spend months traveling Paradise. Only to attempt to cross through Fishman Island, once more. He would have to sail the New World, again. All without his crew by his side. The thought of again was daunting. Luffy began panicking, pulling at the loose strands of hair that fell in waves along his face. Gramps, Luffy called, the beating of his heart increasing the more he remained a mess of limbs on the ground. His grandfather did not hear him. Many thoughts began to overwhelm Luffy, like dark clouds they encompassed him and weighed him down. His crew was somewhere in the New World. This was the first time he had seen his grandfather since Ace's death. He was on Dawn Island. The last time he had been here, Ace had still been alive. Short breaths escaped Luffy's lips, huffing and puffing he grasped at the grass. The sharp emerald blade stabbed at his skin but it didn't cut. It didn't bring Luffy back from his panic. Garp's pacing slowed to a stop. He stared down at Luffy with a twist to his eyebrows, hands clenching and unclenching repeatedly. He sighed in resignation of his situation. Hey, kid, this was his grandson, even if he was a bit older. Still the same brat, judging from the scar along his left eye and the straw hat. Stop wheezing, we got to figure out how to get you back to your own time. Luffy's shoulders tensed, finding it in himself to look up at the vice-admiral. Time? His voice came out croaky. He had grown stronger over 2 years for this exact scenario to never happen. He had never wanted to be separated from his crew again. Yet here he was. Garp rolled his eyes. Yeah. I was just training your kid self when you decided to pop in. Underneath his rough exterior, worry laced his words. He had no idea where his youngest grandson was. I'm back in time? Luffy asked, taking a closer look around the clearing. He had recalled this particular area being burned on the night of the Grey Terminal fires. It was the area Garp had loved to take Ace and Luffy to train. Ace. If Luffy was back in time, then Ace was still alive. It was the fastest way to verify Garp's theory, so he bolted to his feet. Luffy, Garp began, but Luffy was already sprinting down a familiar path. Winding past the sprouting of roots and hanging branches, he bounded over rocks and fallen logs alike. Garp was pursuing him, but Luffy wasn't the same 7-year-old he used to train. He was an emperor now, or at least in the future, he was one. Not only had his strength and control over his devil fruit increased, but he was also faster. Much faster than his old grandfather. His pace slowed as he neared Dayton's hut, but before he could burst through the doors of the shabby den, a small body collided with his. In shock, Luffy reeled back but caught his balance. A mop of black curls greeted him, but it was swiftly replaced by a scowling boy. Ace. Ace. That was Ace. Luffy could recognize Ace anywhere. His black hair, the curls more pronounced when he was older. The brown tan he had during his childhood was a similar shade to Luffy's beige tawny color. The sharpness of his nose, the wrinkles along his eyes whenever his eyebrows furrowed. It was Ace. Alive. And screaming at Luffy. What the hell did you do with Luffy? Big, brown nearly black eyes glared at him and Luffy retreated, Ace falling to the ground as he prepared the pipe higher in the sky. A sense of longing engulfed Luffy, recalling the moments when he hounded after Ace, begging for the boy to be his friend. There were thundering footsteps behind him and Luffy shook himself from his daze. He was back in time. Ace was alive. A large body collided with his and instinctively Luffy knew it was Garp. Hey, brat, just 'cause you're older, doesn't mean you can go off running like a demon escaped from hell. Luffy ducked from his grasp, jumping back and watched as his grandfather stumbled over empty air. Ace and Garp were facing him now, one with threatening intent. Old man, where's Luffy? Ace was glaring at Luffy, pipe held taut in his hands as he pointed it Luffy's way. Garp grunted, mulling over his next words before blurting out. Somewhere, Garp muttered, picking at his nose now that the older version of Luffy was in front of him and standing as still as a statue. Luffy was ignoring their conversation, however, his gaze solely fixated on the short figure in front of him. In his time, before Ace had died, Ace had towered over him. Now, back in the past, Luffy was the taller one. He didn't know how to feel about this. But mostly, he just missed his brother. Ace's eyes were comically wide, darting between his grandfather and the man in front of them, who eerily resembled Luffy. Was he? Ace trailed off, hands white from clenching his pipe too hard. Was he kidnapped? When Luffy was younger, Ace had never shown an ounce of uncertainty. He'd always stood steadfast in his decisions and never cowered. And that trend continued into adulthood, until the very moment that Ace died in Luffy's arms. Shaking himself from his stupor, he took a step forward only to be met with Garp's broad figure. He was blocking Ace from view. Look, brat, you may look like Luffy, and you could be him from the future, Garp began, words like steel. But I want you to act carefully. Luffy blinked owlishly at his grandfather. Luffy recalled the last time he saw the man, during Marineford, and the wounded look he wore. It was so different from the one he bore now. Luffy frowned. I'm not going to hurt Ace. Not in a million years would Luffy ever lay a hand on his brother that wasn't classified as brotherly fighting. Even when they had been pirates competing for the same goal, Luffy never had the intention of harming his brother. Garp's eyebrows furrowed in thought, as though not believing the teenager's words. I promise. Luffy would sooner die than hurt the boy across from him. Ace let out a scoff and shoved at his grandfather. Garp went easily. He accepted Luffy's promise. I'd kick his butt before he could even touch me. Luffy knew full well that the threat wasn't empty, but it certainly didn't disturb Luffy. He had grown stronger, after all, and considerably so. Especially compared to the strength of when they were kids. Where's Sabo? Luffy wondered aloud, glancing around like he might find him hidden among the branches. His eyes caught on a woman peeking through a door and he beamed. Bounding over, he burst through the entrance and embraced the burly woman, who'd been his caretaker as a child. Dayton. The shack of the bandit's home was as run down as he recalled, which he supposed made sense. After all, he was in the past. The bandit let out a squawk of protest, attempting to push the body off of her, but it was futile. Luffy's rubber limbs had already encircled her like a snake. She was trapped. What the F dash? Dayton exclaimed, staring at Garp and Ace through the doorway. Garp was largely unhelpful as he continued to pick at his nose. There was a pat against Luffy's back, urging him to unravel his arms and retreat. He only did so after a drawn-out minute. The last time Luffy had seen the woman, Ace had been alive, and Sabo had still been dead. Gasping, Luffy whirled on Ace and Garp, fist knocking against his palm in realization. Is Sabo at our treehouse? He didn't want to ponder the thought that he was too late. Ace dumbly stared at Luffy, eyebrows furrowing as his gaze flitted between Garp and Luffy before landing on the straw hat atop Luffy's hair. He froze in place, his glare growing sharp in realization. His dark, nearly black eyes traveled to where Luffy knew a scar lay under his left eye, unsuspecting. Old man, Ace murmured, quiet and unsure. His fist was clenched tightly around his pipe, as he attempted to process the situation. Luffy could sympathize. Behind him, Dayton had appeared to come to the same conclusion after all. She had felt the winding of rubbery limbs encompass her. And only one person could do that. What happened to Luffy? Ace hissed between clenched teeth, taking a step forward to inspect the more grown-up version of Luffy. Luffy blinked down at him, watching as Ace circled him like a predator with a perceptive eye. Luffy having been pushed out of the hut by Dayton. Garp snorted, I didn't do anything, kid. Garp remarked, finding that he had to defend himself preemptively before Ace drew the wrong conclusions. Ace stilled, eyes wandering toward Luffy's bright expression, and flinched away. Ace trailed off, cringing away when Luffy tried to reach out. Ace was in front of him, alive and breathing. Luffy thought he would never hear the smooth drawl of his older brother's voice again. And even if it was childish, he could still hear the makings of what his brother would grow into. Why is he older? Luffy picked his nose, finding he also didn't have an answer for this. His grandfather had said time travel, but he hadn't recalled anything as spectacular as that during his brief fight with the devil fruit user. But then, it had been a spontaneous battle, one which his crew hadn't taken very seriously. Dayton grunted, moving to the side of Luffy so she could scowl at the man, properly. She was fiddling with a cigarette as a considering expression dawned on her rugged features. Inside the hut, Luffy could hear the scrambling of bandits as they attempted to listen in on their conversation. Garp, what the hell is this? She rarely spoke so boldly with the Vice Admiral, but Luffy supposed the situation called for it. I think future Luffy, he gestured to Luffy like he were an animal and not his actual grandson. Got himself into some trouble. Ace's eyes widened, his gaze raking across Luffy's frame with a gleam in his eyes. Ace's pupils were caught on the ugly, red scar shaped like an X. And they remained there until Luffy adjusted his shirt to hide it from view. Future Luffy? Ace mumbled, awestruck as he watched Luffy with a vague sense of curiosity. Sabo is going to love this. Relief washed over Luffy like cold water. Sabo was still here, alive and memories intact. He wasn't too late. Dayton bristled, hey, don't get too excited. What if he's an imposter and he's actually kidnapped our Luffy? Her wrinkly face blanched, as she began to panic. Oh my god, what if Luffy is dead? She began pulling at her ginger roots, coughing up smoke in her state of panic. Ace scoffed and grasped Luffy's right arm. Luffy let him do so freely, relishing in the warm skin. Only one way to tell, he muttered tersely and began pulling. Expectedly, the limbs stretched like gum and all suspicions vanished within the group. Ace hummed, dropping Luffy's arm to the forest floor. Huh, I guess he really is Luffy. Ace ped his head to the left in wonder, but where is our Luffy? Ace spun on Garp, then, eyes narrowing to slits. Garp got the message well enough. Casually, like most things Garp did, he shrugged the matter off. I'm sure he's fine. A hearty laugh escaped his dry lips. Good to know he grows up into a fine man. Luffy unconsciously winced. He knew the next words that would fall from his grandfather's tongue. So, you're a Marine, then? Quite the opposite, actually. But because Luffy had a lack of self-preservation, he blurted out his inner monologue, an emperor. Not that he was scared of the repercussions of his words, but a grandson didn't just lose that fear of his grandfather in 2 years. I beat Kaido. Silence engulfed the forest. He could even hear the heavy breathing behind him. Dayton. Ace was the first to speak, perplexed as he attempted to grasp the tension that had draped over the group like a comforter. Who is Kaido? This appeared to pull Garp from his puzzlement, as he whirled on Luffy. There was a thought sour and distant, of a time both so far away and recent. The last time he had seen his grandfather, a face of rage as he challenged Luffy on a bridge to his brother. And with that glimpse of a memory, encompassed by bitter melancholy, Luffy reacted instinctively. When Garp reached out to grasp the nape of Luffy's shirt, again, Luffy's fist was already swinging and making contact with coarse skin. Armament hockey infused with his hand as he punched his grandfather. The man went down to the ground with a surprised gasp. That silence was back again. Shocked, scared, horrified, Luffy could not gather the underlying emotion of it. Luffy's wide eyes glared daggers at the man beneath him. Garp wasn't down for the count. A hit like that, weak, similar damage to that of a pinch, would never bring the Vice Admiral to the ground. But the blow from his older grandson had certainly left the Marine stunned. Worst of all, however, was that Luffy didn't feel an ounce of guilt. Perhaps, he couldn't find it in himself to blame his grandfather for what happened at Marineford. He was old enough to understand that Ace had made his decision to be a pirate. As did Garp. And there was no changing that. But childish rage had resurfaced with only a brief flash of a memory, and well. Garp stood to his feet, looking far from affected by the hit. Luffy hadn't expected any different. His grandfather had never been weak. An emperor, eh? Garp whistled, glimpsing the beginnings of a bruise along his left cheek with his palm. You certainly don't punch like one. I know rookies who hit better than that. Luffy didn't rise to the bait, cowed for the moment. Ace was left dumbstruck between them, a smile curving along his lips, and while it certainly wasn't unusual for the older, adult version of Ace, Luffy recalled little memories of his childhood where Ace had smiled so genuinely. It was only in his later teenage years, when he'd finally learned to accept that there was no getting rid of Luffy's love, that he reached that point. Luffy relished in the moment. If it took punching his grandfather 1,000 times, for the sake of Ace's smile, he would do it. Dayton shoved at Luffy, moving forward with tense shoulders. She was ushering Ace away from the scene, and Ace grumbled in protest. Luffy thought it was awfully motherly of her, but Ace didn't see it like that. Hey, move over, old hag, I want to see Luffy. Older Luffy kicked the old man's butt. Luffy considered the thought he had yet to fight the Marine in the future present. But that wasn't the most pressing matter at hand, even if the thought was exciting. So, you're from the future, then? Dayton grunted out, the cigarette in her mouth clenched between pursed lips. She was covering Ace, protectively, and it filled Luffy's heart with yearning. He had missed the old bandit. Her big, brown eyes narrowed on Garp's still figure. An emperor? She pulled the cigarette out and spit on the ground. Ignoring Ace's disgusted cry, she leveled her glare on Luffy. You may look and act like Luffy, she gestured to the pirate, from head to toe. And you may have his powers, his hat, and his scar? But don't you think you can go starting fights? I don't trust you for a second. Garp waved her away, with a huff. Enough. I know my grandson better than anyone, Garp interjected, eyeing the tense set of Luffy's shoulders and the way he covered the scar across his chest. And I'd be a fool to not recognize his fists. He guffawed. Then, I've been hit by them too much to count, of course. Now, you can't land a hit. He rolled his shoulders, the fabric of his Hawaiian shirt painted with dirt. But I guess you got better at it. He discerned with pride, and Luffy laughed with him, the tension easing with each round of chuckles. My punches really are as strong as pistols now. Luffy boasted, flexing the muscles of his bicep in jest. A scoff from Dayton and Ace, that both grandson and grandfather ignored in favor of shared laughter. Garp halted, suddenly. Don't think I've forgotten you're a pirate, brat. Luffy paled. Ace's hand was small in his. It's a thought that haunted Luffy, as he trailed after his older brother. You're still so slow, even though you're older now, Luffy. Luffy didn't have the heart to tell him that he was intentionally keeping pace with Ace. Besides, he had missed Ace's teasing remarks. Why not indulge in them? Luffy laughed, the sound light and everything free, as he vaulted over an overgrown root. Ace was leading him to their treehouse, remarkably trusting, especially so, considering Ace's character. But Luffy wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. The trees loomed over them, like giants. And Luffy should know, he'd met quite a few. The branches engulfed the sky like a canopy of leaves, leaving only minuscule holes for the sun to peek through. The beams of light rained down on them and illuminated their makeshift path. Dawn Island was as beautiful as ever. Even if Luffy had explored a plethora of islands, he thought that nothing would ever compare to the home forests of his island. Nothing would hold a torch to the treehouse nestled in the groves of a large tree, dusty and old in the future but perfectly maintained during Luffy's childhood. He and Ace had never had the heart to touch the treehouse without Sabo at their flanks. So it remained a faint memory, within a clearing of many, on Mt. Corvo. Now, staring at it, in its former glory, Luffy felt the freedom of his childhood wash over him like a shower. Warm and comforting. The sun cast it in a gentle glow, the afternoon fresh breeze wafting over him like the rocking of the ocean, both of them similar to a lullaby. The treehouse, fixed around the bulky trunk of the tree, was constructed with wood from gray terminal. The roof of it was shabby, looking a second from collapse, but Luffy knew better. The spare pieces of wood supported the roof occasionally, creating makeshift windows along the building. It was perfect, and Luffy expressed this by immediately beginning to climb it. Ace called for him to wait, but Luffy was a crawling monkey in search of his treasure, the embrace of his childhood memories. Pouring into the treehouse, through the hatch at the bottom, Luffy was a giggling mess of limbs. But not for long, as he was promptly smacked in the head with a pipe. He could still hear the faint cries of Ace, demanding that the pirate wait, but it was too late. Luffy had already made contact with the other inhabitant of the treehouse, and subsequently jump-scared the blonde child. Sabo, alive and in the flesh, and lacking his distinct scar that had marred the left side of his face in the future. But his eyes were as bright as then, the blue of them rich with buried memories but a resounding hope lingering in the cerulean. The striking blonde of his hair only stood to pronounce the paleness of his skin a feature which hadn't changed in the future, even if Luffy knew the man had spent countless hours in the sun. The long, navy trench coat only served to dwarf Sabo. It was weird when Luffy had been younger, Sabo had seemed terrifyingly bigger than him. But childish worship had clouded his eyes then, Sabo had been surprisingly short as a child. What the hell? Sabo exclaimed, poising his pipe higher to land another hit against Luffy's skull. Luffy caught it before any damage could be made to his straw hat. Let go! He wrenched the pipe free of Luffy's grasp, but that was because the pirate had made the conscious decision to let it go. He was aware of how skittish his brothers at this age had been. Sabo! A voice called, followed by a mop of black curls. Ace. Ace heaved himself over the entrance and regarded the scene in front of him with a dissecting gaze. Sheet, Luffy, when did you get so good at climbing? He shook his head, as though chasing away the question. It had been stupid, after all. Luffy was older, and this meant he had advanced in a mountain-high list of skills. Luffy? Sabo dumbly questioned, gaze catching on the straw hat against Luffy's neck, and the rugged pink scar under his left eye. He met Luffy's eyes and whatever he saw there, had him lowering his weapon. What's going on, Ace? Apprehension laced his words, as he took a pensive step back. Luffy stayed quiet, an achievement of a lifetime, and watched as Ace attempted to put the situation into comprehensible words. But Ace had never been good with sentences. He preferred his fists over talking, so Luffy filled in for him. I'm Luffy. Silence, then a snort, as Ace leant against the thick trunk the center of the treehouse. There were knife marks against it and Luffy recalled those being from Ace, who'd had too much fun with his knife. You're not Luffy. Luffy is smaller, his blue eyes caught on the making of Luffy's scar, reminding the older boy to cover it before the duo got too curious. He didn't want to explain it. And younger. Oh, I'm from the future. Luffy said, foolishly honest. Sabo stumbled on his feet as he looked to Ace for confirmation. Ace shrugged, eyes lingering on Luffy's casual posture. I mean, the old man says it's him. Sabo paled at that, seemingly accepting the revelation with ease. Garp is here. Sabo began biting at his nails in panic, as he paced against the floorboards and threatened to burn a hole through them. Luffy watched him with vague curiosity. Seeing his two brothers in the same room left him subdued at a loss for words. Captivating was the picture of Ace and Sabo, talking easily like it came naturally to them. Of course, it did, they'd been friends for years prior to Sabo's death. But Luffy could only recall the estranged brother he knew in the future. The warm but haunted smile he wore when he grinned Luffy's way in Dressrosa. So strikingly different, but similar in the tics of their moments. The twitch of Sabo's fingers, the click of his tongue, anything and everything about him was eerily familiar. And while Luffy supposed it made sense he had known Sabo as a child, after all he could not help but feel unsettled with how close younger Sabo was to the future version of him. Like all those years lost between them had never even mattered. Yeah, he took Luffy to train. Came back with this, he pointed to Luffy's sitting frame. Luffy smiled and waved, watching as Sabo's face contorted into horror. Where's our little brother, Ace? Sabo muttered, whirling on his brother like a one-boy storm. To Ace's credit, he didn't flinch. But he did seem rightfully abashed. I don't know. Sabo heaved a breath. You don't know? Sabo was like a snake with how he hissed the words, seething with a quiet sort of rage. Not that both Ace and Luffy couldn't feel it burning hot underneath Sabo's skin like a bonfire from the pits of hell. Ace shrugged, twisting his head to stare at the wall to the right of him and pointedly away from Sabo. Like that would save him from the blonde's wrath. The old man said this Luffy was from the future. Future? Sabo turned to him then, assessing him. He was fixated on the straw hat that Luffy wore. He took a step forward and outstretched his hand, making a grabbing motion with his slender fingers. Can I see that? He didn't need to specify what he was talking about. They all knew. Luffy pulled the hat over his head, disregarding the way the string got caught on his chin for a second. He handed it to Sabo, carelessly, and watched as Sabo stared at it dumbfounded. Ace spoke up first. You gave it to him? He was in awe. Luffy frowned. What's the big deal? It's just my hat. Sabo scowled at him, fingers brushing along the frail straw. It was weathered from the amount of adventures it had experienced, but it felt just the same under his grasp. Just a hat? This is Luffy's treasure. He wouldn't just give this to anyone. Sabo punctuated his words with a wave of the hat remaining delicate each time he swung it. That's how I know you're not Luffy. Luffy blinked at his brothers before a brilliant grin lit up his features like a Christmas tree. You're right, I wouldn't give it to just anyone. But you're my brothers, I trust you with my treasure and my life. Luffy meant each word. There was never a question of whether or not he should trust his brothers, never a how or a why, only a feeling of utmost faith that they would have his back and he would have theirs. Simultaneously, Ace and Sabo gaped at him in wonder. The hat fell to the ground as Sabo's grip gave out. You trust us that much? Sabo murmured, dropping to his knees to carefully lift the hat from its position. He was gentle as he fondled it, staring at it with a fond gaze. And woe, he hadn't recalled his brothers caring for him this much when they were younger. Or more so, he didn't recall them being so soft. Not that he was going to point it out. Of course, you're my brothers. How many times would Luffy have to repeat it before they got the picture? Nothing they could do would shake his faith. It was as deep as the loyalty he had to his crew. And that ran deeper than the location of Fishman Island. Ace huffed, rubbing furiously at the embarrassed blush that decorated his cheeks. He looked like a cherry. That's enough. Point proven, you're our Luffy. Just older. His nose wrinkled at the thought. That doesn't mean you can lord that over our heads. So, don't get any ideas. Luffy chuckled, easily relaxing against the floor. The uneven texture of it dug into his back, but he only relished in the contact. The ceiling above him was made up of several planks of wood, the nails hastily screwed in at random intervals. But Luffy thought it was perfect. Don't worry, I won't. He didn't promise not to make use of his heightened skills, though. Sabo sighed, long and tired. Where's Garp, anyway? He didn't seem like he felt like touching on the most blaring issue at hand, that being that they had an older version of Luffy in their treehouse. Some things were best left for the adults. I don't know. Sabo looked murderous at Ace's carefreeness, so the older boy promptly continued. He said he would stick around until the situation fixed itself. Sabo groaned in protest. I know. But there's nothing I can do. His gaze wandered over to Luffy, less judgmental and more curious. Besides, I'd rather have him here to help. I'm too tired for this. Sabo settled on, dragging his exhausted body to where there was a nest of blankets and pillows, on the other end of the curricular room. I'm taking a nap. Oh, can I join? Luffy beamed, already standing to his feet and shaking off his sandals. Sabo was resigned to his future as a free cuddle pillow. He knew child Luffy's habit of cuddling well enough. And he doubted that had changed, judging by the excited jump of Luffy as he fell into the mess of blankets. Still, Sabo found himself protesting by way of warning his older but younger brother. Stick to your side. Luffy laughed, finding peace in the treehouse filled with the voices of his brothers. He still had an ache for his crew to be at their side, but that was a matter for another day. Today, he was gifted the opportunity of a lifetime. All of his brothers were alive at once. Geez, you guys are embarrassing, Ace remarked, even as he settled in the middle of the two. He was out like a light the next second. Sabo took longer to fall into the embrace of slumber, anxiety clawing at his frame as he whispered a simple question. The future. Is it good? Luffy paused, breath catching as he attempted to understand the simplicity of the question. Sabo hadn't asked for specifics, but it still felt like a gut punch coated with hockey. The best. He thought of Ace and Whitebeard, who died on Marineford. Of Sabaody, where Kuma saved his crew by tearing them apart until they were nothing but strings tethering each other to a lone ship, spread across the globe. He thought of being separated from them for 2 whole years, only to be moved back into battle at Fishman Island. And the alliance with Law. And Wano and Sabo's return from the dead. The memories his older brother grieved. The years of distance between them, only to be brought together by a shared ache for a person that was long gone. It's the best, Sabo. And he meant it. Meant it with his heart because he had to. He had to offer that assurance, even as the familiar, phantom throb of his scar resounded throughout his body. They had made it work in the future. Luffy had an amazing crew and Sabo was making waves as a revolutionary. And Ace had died in Luffy's arms. For the first time since his arrival, he understood that he was in the past. And that meant an opportunity to change things. Change the outcome of Ace's ending. But exhaustion clung to him like an anvil, dragging him into its awaiting grasp. He had no way of knowing how to begin to change the past. So, he let sleep take him as he heard Sabo's breath even out into tiny puffs of air. Rain cascaded from the sky in buckets worth hitting the deck in a mantra of splat. The air was heavy around him, the clouds above a gloomy gray. Beneath him, pools of water had developed, and with each twitch of his leg, it rippled. No one was on deck, bar Shanks, and he preferred it that way. They were anchored on a remote island, undetectable by any log pose. Thanks to the Straw Hat's talented navigator Nami. Shanks recalled that this island was close to Elbaf and considered warning the pirate crew but decided that it was their journey, to begin with. Luffy wouldn't like warnings. He always had a sense of adventure, even at 7. And from the newspapers and the little information from Luffy's crew, this only appeared to ripen with age. Luffy. Little Luffy, on the decks of the Red Force, once more. And how awfully familiar it was to a man who'd been swept up by the currents of time, it almost felt like nothing had changed. Shanks could walk out further on deck and make out the shapes of windmills and little huts, or even Makino's smiling face. But time had passed. Yet, Luffy was once again on his ship. And not for the reasons he would have liked. He had imagined his reunion with Luffy several times. Over. He would finally have grown into his straw hat, a daring smile to accompany it. His hair might have been longer, he'd have more scars, probably. But mostly, he'd smile at Shanks and challenge him. It was always a challenge. And in each scenario, Shanks would lose not without a valiant fight, but he would be okay with his loss. Because Luffy would be ready to be Pirate King and could handle what that would entail. Handle the after. There was a tug at his sleeve, startling him from his stupor. Looking down, it was Luffy, little Luffy. He was so small for the title that he wore. Shanks smiled. "It's raining," he remarked, watching as Luffy's eyebrows twisted in bemusement. "Duh," Luffy retorted, and it was easy. Speaking with him like this, it was as though no time had passed at all. And that was the truth, wasn't it? Luffy was the same Shanks, decidedly, not. But that didn't matter, right now. His heart thrummed with fondness, as he kneeled to guide his fingers through the coarse black locks atop the boy's head. "Why are you out here?" Luffy asked, and there was that ache again. Shanks found that with each day that passed with Luffy on his ship he found that he had regrets. What would have happened if he had taken Luffy with him? Would it have been better? Would Ace have lived? But then Luffy would never find himself brothers. "Someone has to watch the ship," Shanks murmured. Luffy blinked but easily accepted the white lie. Shanks couldn't tell him the truth. For every second he spent inside, he went stir-crazy, over long-healed scars and regrets. "What are you doing out here?" Luffy huffed and pulled away sharply. And for once, he seemed contemplative. Shanks tried not to let the astonishment show on his face. "Everyone is being weird," his nose wrinkled adorably. Shanks hummed, fixing his position until he was sitting cross-legged on the wood. Luffy joined him. "How so?" he asked, if only to fill the silence. "Sword guy," Luffy began, hands fidgeting in his lap. Shanks' gaze remained fixated on the rocking of the ship below him and the sound of water lapping at the flanks. "He keeps," Luffy trailed off, trying to form his words, but the harsh wind nipped at his skin. His cheeks were rosy from the cold. "Shanks, he's being mean." Luffy whined and Shanks nudged him with his shoulder. "Why's that?" Shanks didn't recall the patience he has now that he offered Luffy freely, in the past, and he wondered if it made Luffy uneasy. He pondered how Luffy felt about the future, about everything. And for as much as Luffy was an open book at times, Shanks could never predict him. "He says I can't touch his sword." Shanks wasn't sure why he expected something serious. It was Luffy, after all. "Is that all?" Luffy let out an offended gasp. "What? No." Luffy's cheeks puffed out, akin to a hamster. It was, frankly, adorable. "The skeleton guy is moping all the time. Oh, and the raccoon dog is pulling out his own hair." As Luffy continued to list things that bothered him, Shanks felt a sense of sympathy for his crew. It was as obvious to him as anyone with two working eyes that Luffy, their captain, was their anchor. The very thing that kept them all tethered and sane. And without him, they were quick to fall apart. Shanks opted for a different approach to the conversation. "Do you not like your future crew?" It was teasing, mostly, but Shanks found himself nosy. Luffy paused, then pressed on. "I love them." He admitted, as easily as breathing. "Of course, he did. If I chose them, then it's for a good reason, right?" Shanks smiled. "Right? I just wish," Luffy glared at his sandals too small for his growing body, "that they'd stop looking at me like they do." Shanks halted, entirely, his stare turning to rest on the boy at his side. "What do you mean?" "They look sad and I don't like it," Luffy remarked, idly, picking at his rubber skin. "They're fun," but Luffy stopped himself with a sigh. "They're not like Ace and Sabo." Shanks froze. Several minutes' worth of silence encompassed the pair, as Shanks mulled over his next words. Both crews had agreed to not mention Marineford to Luffy. There were times that Luffy referred to his brothers with fondness seeping into his words, and each time, it stole their breaths. Because how did you hide away something which could destroy an entire person's world? How did you act normally when Luffy mentioned his dead brother like he was still living and breathing among them? He had yet to ask where they were, and that was a blessing in itself, but he would. It was only a question of when. I suppose they're not, huh? Shanks finally spoke, his heart clenching as he forced the words from his mouth. He was quick to change the topic even as flashes of Ace's relaxed features upon death were fresh in his mind. It's cold, isn't it? Luffy blinked. Yeah, just now noticing the chilly weather, he wrapped his arms around himself. He was shivering as he said, Shanks. It's cold. Shanks laughed, loud and boldly. Because Luffy would always be the same. 7 or 19, he would still carry that naive and trusting nature along his shoulders like a king's cloak. The only difference truly between the two versions of Luffy was that present Luffy had proven himself worthy of being so careless. However, Shanks supposed this Luffy would eventually do that too. Shanks stood to his feet, effortlessly even with one hand. He disregarded the way his clothes felt heavy against his skin and the way droplets of water poured down the slope of his cheek and down to his collarbone. He would dry himself when he knew Luffy was taken care of. Come, let's get some towels. He took Luffy's hand in his, it was small in his grasp. Luffy trailed after him, the slap of sandals echoing against hardwood as they made their way below deck and into a narrow hallway. The ceiling curved and therefore Shanks had to duck, but it came naturally to him. This was his home, after all. This fact didn't stop Luffy from giggling at Shanks. He muttered something about Shanks being tall and Shanks tried not to laugh with him. He failed. It was another day, the third, maybe? When the transponder snail rang loudly across the deck of the Red Force. Shanks jumped from his seat on a barrel and watched as Yasopp answered, hello. It was hesitant but firm. Shanks could not hear the other end, but by the beckoning of Yasopp's hand, he was being called over. Dropping the cards he was playing with to the table, he disregarded Lucky Roo's protests and took the receiver promptly from Yasopp. Shanks didn't get a chance to talk. Before somebody was speaking. Hello, is this red-haired Shanks? The voice was collected and masculine and Shanks did not recognize it. He frowned. Yes, he replied briskly. Who is this? Sabo, and just like that, Shanks' breath was stolen. Luffy's brother, then. He remarked, his fingers drumming idly around the steel in his hands. I'm guessing you heard about his situation? A pause on the other end, the sound of shuffling papers and then, yeah. Robin informed me. Is he all right? It surprised Shanks how uneasy the second in command of the revolutionaries sounded. But this was also Luffy's brother. Shanks thought of the boy who was in the ship's galley and eating to his heart's content. Yeah, he's doing fine. Great, more so. Sabo breathed a relieved sigh, that's good, great, even. Sabo rushed out and Shanks wondered if this was his natural self or if he was just overly concerned for his little brother. Shanks could not rule out either option. I've made arrangements to arrive at your current island, in about, more sounds of shuffling papers before Sabo was talking, once more. One day. Was that even possible? Shanks didn't know his current location, but he was pretty sure the revolutionaries' base was somewhere in paradise. Instead of questioning it, Shanks asked, are you sure that's a good idea? The snail's features twisted into a frown, I'm prepared to lie. Shanks' eyebrows rose at the man's words. He's my little brother, his only remaining brother, was left unsaid. I'm going to protect him. He's safe with me. Shanks wasn't sure why he said it. He understood it would sound like empty reassurance to a man who had practically lost everything in one day. But he still did. A scoff, I know. But I'm not leaving an opportunity to fate. Sabo muttered tersely, leaving no room for argument. I've given you 24-hour notice, I expect my brother to be in one piece when I arrive. The or else was implied. Shanks didn't bother to bite back the smile that bloomed on his face. He knew the man's threats weren't empty, all the more exciting. He moved to retort, but the line was promptly cut short by Sabo. He stared incredulously down at the transponder snail. A chuckle from behind him garnered his attention. Robin, Luffy's archaeologist. The one who watched after her child captain, most days. He does that, she said. Luffy was at her side, too, clinging to her legs and watching Shanks with open curiosity. Who was that? He asked, and Shanks opted for something towing the lines of truth and lies. A surprise, he settled on. A mistake on his part, as Luffy promptly began badgering him for hints. Robin watched on fondly. True to his word, Sabo arrived 24 hours later, on a dinghy propelled by flame. Shanks tried not to be reminded of Ace when he saw it. With an arch of fire, he threw himself in the air in a brilliant show of oranges, reds and yellows. And just as gracefully as he had flung himself, he landed on the deck, soundlessly. Sabo was different, compared to his brothers. Maybe it was the way in which he carried himself, reserved but observant. Quiet but destructive. Distant but kind. But also his features, striking blue eyes and a scar that marred the left side of his face. Blonde hair that fell to his ears in waves and a top hat that dwarfed his head. Not to mention the certain aesthetic he paraded around with. Draped in noble-like clothes, from the navy trench coat to his cravat, he certainly had a message to tell with his clothing choices. Not that Shanks could judge with his rather simple white blouse, red sash and green-yellow baggy pants, with a hideous floral pattern. "Hello," Sabo greeted, smiling as Robin embraced him. "Robin," he murmured, fond. "It's nice to see you. Though, I wish it was under better circumstances." At his shoulder, flame trickled off into smoke. "Nonetheless, I'm happy to see you again." She was the only straw hat on board today. Most of them had figured to give Luffy and Sabo their space. Shanks was just about to do that, but Sabo was speaking again, catching his attention. "And where's Luffy?" There was the tension Shanks had expected. It lined his shoulders like an anvil, weighing Sabo's every step as he pulled away from Robin and moved towards the Emperor. A shared trait among all three brothers, then. Ace had proudly declared his intention of fighting Whitebeard and Luffy had challenged Kaido. Now, Sabo openly tested the limits with Shanks. "He's here," Robin jumped in expertly, sensing the way flames began to dance at Sabo's fingertips. "And safe." And just like that, with one little reassurance from Robin, the anxiousness seeped from Sabo's frame into something more relaxed. Shanks watched it all, impassive. He wasn't remotely threatened by the man, if only concerned for his mental state. Right, yeah." Sabo exhaled, shoulders drooping. Any fire that had been created had promptly been returned to little clouds of smoke. "Sorry, I..." "Don't worry," Shanks said, finally speaking. It caught Sabo off guard as the blonde whirled to stare at Shanks. "It's been weird for all of us." Not exactly true. Luffy being 7 again was a walk in the park for Shanks after all. That's all he had known Luffy as. A little boy lost on the shores of Windmill Village. But it did come with a basket of regrets that Shanks had desperately tried shoving and hiding in a closet. Like how he wished he had kept his son on board. But those were thoughts for another time. "Red-haired Shanks," Sabo spoke with reverence, "Luffy used to talk about you all the time." It shattered the pressure that was mounting between them and Shanks' crew behind him, settled in their seats. Suddenly, Sabo bowed deeply and Shanks felt a sense of déjà vu. "Thank you for saving my brother all those years ago." Sabo's features were stern but as honest as they could mold themselves to be. "I should have thanked you long ago, but I was incapacitated." "Ah, hadn't Ace done the same?" "The apple didn't fall far from the tree, then." Shanks waved him off. "It's all right, really." Sabo's head lifted to stare openly at Shanks' missing arm. Shanks didn't feel anything from the empty gaze. It was hardly judging, more so, curious. "I was just doing what any person would do." Sabo hummed, accepting his answer. "Maybe not any person, but sure. Thank you, anyway. Unfortunately, I'll have to cut this short. I need to see my brother for my own sake." Shanks nodded and offered to lead him to where the boy slept, below deck. He had refused to leave the Red Force since arriving, to the annoyance of his crew. But they mostly understood he was still a 7-year-old in a new and terrifying situation. As Shanks led Sabo below deck and through narrow hallways and around sharp turns, the air was silent between them. But finally, they stopped at a door. It was tucked into the corner, a closet converted into a makeshift bedroom for Luffy. Robin and Luffy occupied it, most nights. Shanks knocked dutifully, hopefully waking Luffy from his afternoon nap. There was grumbling from the other end as Luffy presumably stood to his feet and scrambled towards the door. He opened it, and Shanks watched with fondness as Luffy's face lit up in recognition. Despite how old Sabo was, he still found his brother in his features. "Sabo!" Luffy cheered, engulfing the man in a hug of rubbery limbs. There were fresh tears decorating his face, pouring from Luffy's eyes like rain. Shanks held down the smile that threatened to break his calm facade. I'm so happy to see you." Sobs echoed in the hallway as Shanks stood awkwardly to the side, witnessing something that probably should be private. But he didn't want to leave his anchor's side. Not when he looked so broken. So, he remained as a testament to the pure love that bound the two brothers. "Luffy," Sabo murmured with awe. You're so small." His eyes sparkled in delight as he lifted his little brother and proceeded to spin him in joy. Luffy was less than happy, in the whirling arms of his brother, and he vocally protested that, much to the chagrin of Sabo and Shanks' ears. Sabo, tears still fell from his round eyes, but there was an edge of annoyance to them. "Put me down. I am not small. You're just big." Sabo's laughter rang loudly in the small hall and Shanks took a step back. The floorboard creaked beneath him, catching the attention of the reunited brothers. "I forgot you were here." Sabo deadpanned, having crushed Luffy in a hug. Luffy made a face, likely because his cheek was pressed against his brother's chest. Shanks flushed as he made an attempt to leave, but Luffy was already objecting. No, I want Shanks to stay. At Sabo's silence, Luffy turned his pleading eyes on his brother and Shanks watched as Sabo fell victim to Luffy's puppy eyes. Sucker. Okay, fine. Without so much as a glance Shanks' way, he entered into the den that they called Luffy's room. Shanks followed, albeit at a slower pace. He was greeted by pitch black and the rocking of the boat. You couldn't have given him a lantern, a candle? Luffy hates being alone. Sabo said, assumedly sitting against the mattress squished into the corner. Shanks frowned, offended. He wasn't alone, Robin joined him. A hum escaped Sabo. Despite not being able to make out any identifying features in the dark, Shanks knew Sabo had understood, well enough. And as for the lights, Shanks winced. I was worried he'd knock it over and start a fire. He could still recall Luffy moving in his sleep at any chance he got like it was yesterday. A laugh, yeah, he does that. It came out fond. Stop talking about me like I'm not here, Luffy muttered. The sounds of shuffling echoed, the bed beneath creaking as they got comfortable. Shanks settled against the only remaining space. The small fraction of empty floor by the bed, he sat and listened as the brothers talked. Sabo, I've missed you. Luffy cried, full of utter joy as he began jumping against the mattress. My crew's nice, especially Robin and Jinbei. But I'm glad you came, though it SCKS that we're not on the same crew. As if a thought just occurred to Luffy, he plowed on. Hey, where is Ace? Silence filled the room like a blanket. It suffocated them. Ace is busy, Sabo said easily and Shanks tried to even out his breathing. Shanks could practically hear the frown in Luffy's voice, but you came. A breathy laugh emitted from Sabo as he replied, like lying was second nature to him. Maybe it was. He was a revolutionary, after all. And they tended to work in the shadows like ghosts. Shank appreciated their work, how could he not, but they still creeped him out. They knew too much, for their own good. I did. Sabo conceded, but that's because I wasn't busy. Another lie. The chief of staff was always busy. Luffy huffed, what's Ace doing, then? How had this conversation derailed so much? No. This was expected, of course. Luffy would be curious about his other brother. To him, it had only been 4 days ago that his brother's heart still sang a song. But that was 2 years ago, now. Mirth veiled the pain in Sabo's voice as he said, are you looking to spoil your adventures? A gasp from Luffy, and Shanks could not hide the smile on his face, even if he wanted to. No. Don't tell me more. Shanks joined in on the laughter. Luffy was humming again, as he asked, Are you both free? Luffy asked after a moment, quiet and solemn, and Shanks had the distinct impression, for a brief second, that Luffy was smarter than he let on. Yet, no one mentioned it. Sabo's breath audibly hitched. There it was again, that silence. When both men were caught off guard. Shanks thought of the smile on Ace's corpse. What was more free than that? To die smiling, surely was a freedom in itself. At least this was the excuse Shanks offered himself so that he might not feel the same guilt that ate at him. Ace was free in Sabo? I'm working on it, Sabo settled on, smoothly. And Ace, well, he's as free as they come. Luffy brightened at this, good. My brothers deserve that. I hope I have it too. Shanks' head knocked against the wood paneling of the closet, mulling over the conversation like it was the answer to the universe and not something as mundane as it was. Because to him, it was heart-shattering. To be reminded of his failure, his captain's son, dead, before him and Shanks too late to save anyone. There was some irony there. He couldn't save his captain from his fate and neither could he save his son's life. Perhaps Shanks was just cursed. You're the freest, said Shanks, finally. He could feel 2 pairs of eyes on him, probing. Of us all. Sabo concluded, winded. Winded from what? Shanks didn't know. The 5th day was largely unremarkable, barring the chaos it brought to the ship with 1 revolutionary on board. The straw hats were back, too. And partying which Shanks could get in on. A good party or 2 would go a long way to boost morale. This, unfortunately, meant that Usopp and Yasopp would be in the same vicinity. At first, Shanks had expected some mighty clash between the 2 sharpshooters, but alas, both were cowards in the face of each other. They spent the party avoiding one another like the plague. Disappointing, but Shanks pretended not to notice he would be no help to the situation. He couldn't even begin to wrap his mind around the reunion with his own son. How could he even help Yasopp besides give him a shove? Though, Shanks supposed that would be more help rather than the short glances they spared at each other when one of them wasn't looking. It was pathetic on Yasopp's part. A body stood to his left, quiet and brooding, and at first, Shanks mistook it for Beckman. He turned to greet his first mate, only to be met with the face of Roronoa Zoro and his scarred left eye. Mint green hair, high cheekbones, and a grim expression. Hello, Shanks said, veiling his surprise. His gaze searched for Beckman, only to find him amid the crowd with Luffy climbing him like a jungle gym. Shanks, right? It was largely unnecessary, but Zoro was a man of few words. Shanks had garnered that much. At Shanks' nod, Zoro pushed on. Luffy mentioned once that you two made a promise. Shanks thought of a sandy beach and a rotting dock, a lone boy at the forefront of it all. The water had lapped at the pillars of the dock and rocked its weak frame. Shanks had hardly noticed as Luffy's words washed over him like a summer's wind-fresh touch. The air around them had smelled like brine, and where it would have been overwhelming any other day, Shanks was too distracted to care. Luffy had promised many things that day, and Shanks held little doubt in his heart that he would accomplish it. He did. He could still recall the warmth of the sun on his back and the sting of his missing limb, as his phantom limb ached. He even said he would gather a crew even better than mine. Shanks paraphrased Luffy's words, and he wondered if that day had been destiny. It certainly felt like it. Sounds like Luffy, it was affectionate, and Shanks grinned. But he's not there, yet, Zoro remarked, expression stern and watching his little captain as though his life was in constant danger. Shanks watched him, curious and pensive. We're not to your level yet, Zoro reiterated bluntly, not leaving room for argument. That's why, when, he said with little trepidation, he returns, we'll be leaving, immediately. What we've done here is break your promise. Zoro's lips pulled into a frown. We didn't want to at first. Zoro's eye was glued to Luffy, but he begged us. Shanks mulled over the first mate's words and sighed. The promise isn't broken, Shanks smirked, after all, Luffy has yet to become a pirate. Zoro appeared cowed by Shanks' answer. Besides, I don't think it will be long until you're challenging us. Zoro's pursed lips took a dangerous turn, as he smiled, slyly. Luffy will beat you. It was all he said as he left to seek out alcohol from the group of partygoers. Shanks wasn't remotely insulted by this, he relished in it, even. Shanks was full of faith, even as he eyed Luffy's tumble to the ground. Robin was an inquisitive woman, by nature. And therefore, Shanks wasn't surprised that when the sun had fallen below the waterline, she had found herself at Shanks' side with a mug of amber liquid offered his way. A gift, she said with an easy smile. Shanks couldn't help but think of Eni's lobby. Razed to the ground in the name of this woman. At the Straw Hat's hands. Shanks took the drink with a grin of his own and chugged it, the satisfying burn of it all the more enticing. Say, Shanks said, disregarding the buzz he felt beneath his skin thanks to the warm drink. Your swordsman mentioned that Luffy begged. It would seem that he didn't have to offer up an explanation, as Robin understood. Yes, I suppose he did. Robin shrugged, leaning against a wall. It's mostly our fault, however. When he appeared, it was unfortunate timing. We just handled the devil fruit user when he had spawned in, and well, needless to say, he was terrified. Robin's painted lips tilted down. I don't think I've ever seen him like that. Besides, she trailed off. Besides? Shanks pushed the topic, a cautious curiosity filling him. 2 years ago, our crew was split by the tyrant Kuma, Robin said, oddly solemn. He wore that same expression he had that day. She shook herself, as though chasing away the memories. Times have changed, however. Kuma is no longer our enemy, and Luffy is small. Are you okay? Is your crew handling it well? Shanks asked because truthfully, he hadn't really given much thought to the crew and whatever heartache they might be experiencing without their captain at their side. It was jarring at first, but we've grown accustomed to it. Luffy's quite adorable, anyway. Robin pet her head in thought. Regardless, by my estimation, he'll return in only 2 days. How did you figure that out, anyway? Shanks slumped to the ground, finding the wood flooring to be damp from last night's shower of rain. Robin chuckled. Well, I say estimation, but it was only through intense interrogation that we gathered the information. Shanks could read between the lines, well enough. Shanks bobbed his head, feeling the effects of alcohol in his system as each action he made became sluggish, in nature. Mighty guessin' game you got going on there. He murmured, closing his eyes and letting the fresh air wash over and turn his cheeks rosy. Robin's responding laughter was tinged with distaste, and Shanks could sympathize. It wasn't unfounded for a crew to feel protective over their captain, at least those that had formed close-knit bonds, like the red-haired pirates or the Roger pirates. And he supposed, the Straw Hats, now. Thank you, she retorted, mirth lacing her words. Shanks felt sleepy on deck, surrounded by Luffy's and his crew's boisterous voices. I'm happy Luffy has found himself such dependable friends. Family, more like it. But he felt as though he didn't need to say it. They were well aware of the connections that bound them. And maybe it was Shanks on the verge of falling into a slumber that loosened his lips, but he blurted out with little thought, thank you for looking after my son. He never saw Robin's perceptive gaze or reserved grin, only heard her words as he succumbed to the drowsiness that overtook him. Of course, Luffy means everything to us. To me. Shanks felt content as he drifted off. Do you plan to change anything? Sabo asked, hushed as the air settled around them in a tentative peace. Luffy didn't dare breathe, in fear of what might escape his lips. It would be easy to express it all, his worries, his grief and the despair of the future. His brother's presence, beside him, was warm and enticing, in the sense that he didn't want to leave them ever again. He wanted to spill every little detail he could scrounge up from the crevices of his mind, yet, his lips remained sealed. Ace hummed, using the sharp edge of his blade to carve at the surface of a stick. A spear for a trap of sorts, he explained moments before. Luffy recalled many of those in his childhood, and distantly, he wondered if his hands could do the same ministrations with the ease with which Ace did so. It had been so long since he had made traps to catch the smaller prey, ones which galloped with haste like that of Kizaru. What could he change? Ace questioned, biting his teeth as he tested the formation of a tip at the end. It wasn't as cutting as he wished it to be, so he returned to carving. Sabo shrugged. Anything, I mean, the future, you have to have some regrets, right? Sabo regarded Luffy then, his eyes a burning blue. And perhaps Ace and Sabo had always been destined for the Mera Mera no Mi, in their own ways. Regret, Luffy mulled the word over his tongue, fiddled with it in his mind. Regret, a simple word that encompassed so much. In another life maybe if he had all familiar thoughts but blurry to him now. He thought of Jinbei and his words, what's gone is gone. But ask yourself this, what remains? Then, it had been his crew. But left in the past, with ghosts that sit beside them, whole and with beating hearts, he wasn't so sure, now. I don't have regrets, he said in place of anything risky. He danced around it, avoiding lying because frankly, he hadn't grown out of his nasty lying skills. I made a promise, years ago, to live a life with no regrets. He didn't mention the who, or why, only that it happened and he intended on living by it like a code of honor. He owed his brother that much. Ace was watching him now, expression contorted into something like a sneer, but not quite. Like he couldn't grasp the emotion that filled him. Luffy wondered how he had never noticed the minuscule twitches of Ace's expressions, during their shared childhood. You're a pirate? Ace leaned forward, squinting his eyes, the freckles along his brow crinkling with the action. What's that like? Luffy blinked, a grin overtaking his face. Fun. My crew is strong, this, he can do. This is familiar, talking about his crew and their adventures. And super cool. Our archaeologist? Grave robber, or whatever, she has a devil fruit. She can grow her body from anywhere. Sabo grinned, the gap in his teeth evident with how wide his lips spread. His hair was growing longer, but not to the extent it was when Sabo had died? No, that can't be right, Sabo was alive. But Luffy supposed Sabo had died, in a way, all those years ago. The brother he met in the future, was vastly different to the one he talked to now. Not that he minded his brothers would be his until the end, there was no escaping the sake that bound them the same as the blood of the womb. Sabo was the first to move away from the triangle they had unconsciously formed, his eyes taking a brisk glance around the surrounding clearing and woods. He sighed, I feel like I'm being watched. Luffy jumped to action, risking a peek into the growth of the forest where he knew his grandfather remained, shrouded by the extensive population of leaves. That his presence would be so obvious, even in the face of a Sabo with no haki, it made Luffy snort a laugh. What is it? Ace grumbled, offering him a glare. His black eyes were glinting, however, like the sound of Luffy's laughter was pleasant and amusing. Luffy smiled, blowing his tongue in a manner that never quite escaped him. Old habits die hard and all that. Ace throwing the stick in his hands was expected, admittedly. Fortunately, Luffy possessed future sight and twisted his body out of the way. Dayton watched him, ire lacing her features as she gave him a once-over. You've grown, brat. She said in lieu of addressing the ugly scar that marred his chest like a proclamation of owned property. Garp was beside her, a largely unhelpful presence. I'd hope so, he tried to say but was promptly cut off by the wagging of Dayton's several cigarettes. She wasn't done. So, pirate, eh? Luffy wondered when she had lost fear for his marine grandfather, or rather, was she too enthralled by the concept of time travel to care? Luffy could sympathize, either way. Time travel had its merits. Figured you'd turn out a criminal, like your no-good father. She paused at Garp's unwavering silence and how it engulfed the room like a condemning hammer. She retreated, fiddling with the mass amounts of cigarettes held between her meaty fingers. Luffy merely blinked, watching as his grandfather's face became swathed in shadows. Whether of a haunting past or the general gloomy lighting of the bandit's hut, he was unsure. Dragon? He questioned, the name unfamiliar on his tongue as much as Dad was. He hadn't ever given much thought to the concept of a father. He had Dayton, his brothers, and Shanks. And his crew in the future. What more was needed? So, you know about him, huh? Garp leant forward in his crooked seat, hands fixed together in contemplation. Like this, Luffy could understand why he was the infamous hero of the Marines. He radiated power in droves. Not that Luffy was intimidated, but more so, impressed that his grandfather could switch between personas as fast as a flash of lightning. He'd heard that it was the same for him, described as though he was a different person when he became serious. It had never crossed his mind until he was faced with the mirror image of him, only a meter away. You told me, Luffy didn't get the big deal over his father. Most wanted man alive, blah, blah. He could care less. Ace's father had been the most wanted, at one point, hadn't he? What did it matter how infamous his father was? It's been a while. It felt like eons had passed between rescuing Robin and where Luffy now stood, as an emperor. The very thought of who exactly his father was fleeting at best. Sabo's boss, if he cared enough to remember. It's not that he didn't care, he just hadn't met the man, and his adventures always took precedence over a person who claimed Luffy's blood as his. Real piece of work your father is. Garp didn't sound inclined to say more, but his words were fond, nevertheless. Dayton scoffed, troublemaker like you, if I remember correctly. She bobbed her head. In Luffy's direction. I wouldn't trust your memories, with how you've aged. A face full of cigarettes was Garp's only response, that, and the creative array of insults Dayton spewed from her mouth like it was gospel. Not that Luffy had ever regarded her as a religious woman, far from it, in fact. What did they want? Ace asked, just as the door slammed shut behind Luffy. He heaved a sigh of relief, and with it, he took in the cozy rush of musty pine air and the crisp honeyed tinge of the forest that surrounded Dayton's home. He attributed it to nostalgia that made him reminisce about his time spent with Dayton and her bandits. Luffy didn't bother to consider his words. Talk, I think. Ace huffed, twisting his pipe in the air in a motion that was so bone-achingly easy and free that Luffy yearned for something he wasn't aware he missed. Melancholy, the passive feeling of something lost but right in front of him, just out of reach. He wanted to clutch Ace and warn him, plead for him to not turn back when Akainu snapped his jaws with roaring insults. He knew it was too much to ask of his brother, who always burned with a little extra fire than the rest. There'd been a time when Ace had come back from Grey Terminal, tipsy long after Sabo had been shot down by celestial dragons, and he'd murmured something that Luffy never managed to shake away. Anyone ever told you, you're like the sun? Well, okay, not in that way, everyone is drawn to you, you know. It was so uncharacteristic of Ace, and Luffy had never been the same since. Of course, the statement had been followed by Ace succumbing to sleep in the blink of an eye. Luffy thought, now, faced with his brother Ten and still coiled taut with the same burden of his future and past the same anger and hatred, that he was the sun all along. Luffy and Sabo chased after him, even after his flames had long since extinguished. Luffy still was, standing before Ace, lost and exhausted. It draped over him, suddenly, and he tried not to let it show. But the weight of his missing crew and the aspect of facing his long-dead brother, again, had left him a husk of what he should be. He's an emperor, now, he thought, distantly. But it didn't matter, not when he was with his big brother. All that became minuscule. Perhaps, Ace was right to refer to him as his fumbling kid brother, even near the end. It's all he would be when he was beside Ace, drawn back to the same dynamics of their childhood like a magnet. Really, that's it? Ace raised his eyebrow, peering behind Luffy like he might catch a glimpse of whatever adult conversations he'd not been privy to. Boring, he murmured with a pout. Luffy frowned, a small thing, adoring around the edges. He also mentioned time travel. Luffy shrugged, trailing after Ace as they continued their trek back to the treehouse, where they'd spent most of their time. Figures, Ace muttered, pushing a low-hanging branch out of the way only for it to whack Luffy a second later. He snickered. So, they figure a way for you to go back, yet? He appeared eager and Luffy didn't so much as blink. Luffy rubbed his face, even if the nature of his body made it so the pain was non-existent. A week? He hadn't been listening, truthfully, the novelty of the conversation having worn out after the tiring ordeal of discussing Dragon. Luffy's hand unconsciously sought out the frail straw of his hat, its presence nothing short of consoling. Something like that. He laughed, freely, letting the sound echo amongst the trees. He could practically imagine Ace's frown, as he spoke. How do they even know that, anyway? Luffy scratched his chin in thought, attempting to recall anything of note. It was mostly a blur, his grandfather and Dayton spilling insults at each other at any given moment. Something about a book of devil fruits. I wasn't really listening. If Ace was surprised, he didn't show it. Anything cool? There was a flame fruit, Luffy said, without thought. He didn't regret his words. He watched Ace's back, the muscles lax and tan beneath the heavy gaze of the sun. The Mera Mera no Mi. It was one of the few fruits that he memorized, besides his own. Etched into his mind were the sharp edges of the orange fruit. A logia, the power of fire, and like a dance it had flickered alongside Ace. It's a logia. Ace glanced at him. Since when do you read books? He appeared skeptical. Luffy laughed. I don't. But my crew does. Or, some of them do. Besides, how could Luffy not know the fruit like it was his own? At one point it had been Ace's heart, just as it was Sabo's in the future. Ace rolled his eyes, shifting his shoulders as he gestured in front of him. Sabo mentioned going down to Windmill Village, if you want. Makino. Luffy gasped, practically beaming bright like the sun above them. I haven't seen her in so long. Ace's eyebrows drew together in a worried knot. Geez, you're weird. It wasn't scathing and Luffy supposed it was an improvement. Above them, the branches stretched out across the sky and created a canopy of leaves, the sun shining through in thin beams. The air around them was crisp with a tinge of resinous. It was thick and NTMT on his tongue. Home, Luffy thought, breathless. Makino's bar was the same as he remembered, which made sense considering the PRD he'd been discarded in. Party's bar was decorated against a worn sign, the white paint of it chipping as it aged. As Luffy stepped across the creaking deck below him and past the saloon doors, he found that the air was butterscotch-tinted and musky. It was peaceful, with most of the typical patrons having left in a hurry at the sight of Ace. His reputation even extended to the small, lone village by the shore of Goa Kingdom. Makino was behind the bar, unassuming as she dried a glass in her hands. She looked up at the sounds of wood cracking beneath weight and flashed a dazzling customer service smile. It vanished within a second when it landed on the trio before her. Ace, Sabo, she greeted, her stare catching on the straw of Luffy's straw hat and how it billowed from the wind at his back. She tracked the hat down to his features, stopping where the pink scar remained below his left eye. Ace was the first to step forward, hauling Sabo behind him with a huff. I'm hungry, he announced like all was normal and situated himself on the stools by the counter. The leather of it was worn and the same as Luffy remembered it. If he paid close enough attention, he might hear the distant howling laughter that once overtook this bar, with each visit from the red-haired pirates. Makino blinked, her big brown eyes flickering between the pair of boys sitting at her counter. Right, I should have something saved, she trailed off, throwing Luffy curious glances as she turned away and began inspecting the cooler at her feet. Boys, why don't you introduce me to your friend? And where's Luffy? At his name, Luffy brightened and in quick steps, reached the counter. Makino! He exclaimed with all the energy he could muster, which was to say, a lot. Makino's head whipped up in alarm, settling her heavy gaze on him. Her hair was still trimmed short to her jaw, the green tint of it shining underneath the dim glow of the fluorescent lighting. I'm sorry, do we know each other? Luffy's lips tilted down, but before he could speak up in protest, Sabo was already offering an explanation. This is Luffy, from the future. He remarked, simply. Makino halted entirely. She gulped. Future? Luffy took this as the initiative it was and began talking, words falling from his lips before he could truly learn them. It's been so long. I'm a pirate, now just like Shanks. Makino's soft features twisted, contorting into something less friendly. Luffy ignored it. Oh, yeah, I also got stuck here, after fighting this devil fruit user. I have a crew, too, but they're in the future. I'm sorry, you expect me to just believe you're... Ace stood on his stool, balancing precariously as he reached up and took Luffy's straw hat that hung from his neck. It's really him, Makino, look. He gave her the hat, and without protest, Luffy let them manhandle it. He watched, as she fiddled with it and inspected the crimson ribbon. But, time travel, it's a bit much, right? She laughed, quiet and concerned. Her eyes were glinting with something, as her fingers traveled against where the stitches had been sewn by Nami to repair the hat. I mean, this is his hat, but, she looked at Luffy, peering deeply into his eyes like she might extract all that lived behind them. You look different. She pointedly glanced at the scar that sat center amid his chest. I'm older, he supplied, and stronger. She nodded, a bit far away from the whole matter. Sabo spoke up, to the right of Luffy. You never did mention how you got that scar. It wasn't accusatory, but it certainly wasn't friendly. Sabo had always been too smart for his age. Luffy smiled, avoiding the piercing stares. A battle, was all he said, thinking of the war that had transpired around him. The hoarse cries, the blood it had stuck to his skin, even days after the event. Some of it may have been his, or Ace's. But there were times when Luffy had slipped in something that wasn't a pool of water, but something dark and thick. I'm alive, though. So is my crew, so it's not a big deal. He had only survived it thanks to Law, Jinbei, and the Whitebeard pirates. This, he was aware of. Makino hummed, well, Luffy, his name fell oddly off her tongue. I'll feed the three of you, for a price. At her words, she'd captured the brothers' attention. Tell us about the future or, more so, about you. I want to know if you've been well, okay? Luffy was never smart, not like Nami, Robin, or Chopper. And he certainly hadn't ever had the self-preservation skills to ration food or to lie. That had always been Sanji and Usopp's job. What he lacked, his crew made up for. But he knew, face to face with Makino, his brothers on either side of him, that what he said here would have consequences. But Luffy had never been a person to care for consequences, and when met with Makino's open, kind eyes, he fell into the fathomless pit. Like what? He pet his head, taking a seat between his brothers and waiting as she began to prepare a meal behind the bar on the counter. It was easy work, with having leftovers stashed in her cooler for her lunch. Ace spoke up, "You mentioned being an emperor, right? What is that, exactly?" Ace didn't like being left in the dark, evidently. "And, a Kaido? Whoever that is." Makino was silent, behind the counter. Luffy hummed, watching her thin white hands work in earnest to prepare the sandwiches. She added extra layers of chicken. He grinned. Kaido was an emperor, too, he offered simply, mostly distracted by the sight of meat. "My crew and Io, Toro and Gizo's crews too. And the samurai. We all beat up Kaido and his crew members." "Is that how you became an emperor?" Makino was taking this all in remarkably well. Luffy shrugged, watching as she diligently arranged lettuce across the several sandwiches. "I guess, though, I don't really care. My real goal is..." "Pirate King," Sabo interjected, "we know, don't worry." Luffy giggled, brightly. Makino inhaled, deeply, "And? How close are you?" She gave him a brisk glance, her stare lingering, but Luffy didn't give it much thought. "Really close." Luffy gushed, "We have 3 of the things we need to find the last island." Ace stayed silent throughout the discussion, contemplative. "Your adventure is coming to a close, then." She smiled, small and fond. "Have you seen Shanks yet?" "No, not yet, but soon, I'm sure." Luffy's constant smile dimmed for only a moment, but it didn't go unnoticed. "I miss him." Makino sighed, "At the speed you're going, I'm sure you'll come across each other soon enough." Ace took this as the moment to speak up. "Luffy, I'm not on your crew, right?" His face was screwed together in disgust, as though he couldn't fathom the thought. Luffy didn't stutter, but he did stumble, considering Ace's words. Would Ace have joined Luffy's crew, if he had lived? Not that it wasn't the first time the thought had crossed his mind, only that with his brother beside him, now, it left a tainted taste on his tongue in its wake. "You have your own crew, they're super strong too." Luffy beamed, eagerly taking the offered sandwich from Makino and shoveling it down. "As the first one was finished," he said, "they even saved my life a couple of times." More than a handful, he would reckon. Ace appeared content with this, but Sabo spoke up next. "I'm not on either of your crews, right? I want to be my own captain." Luffy laughed, thinking of where Sabo was now. "I don't know, you're like a spy?" Luffy remarked, "Not nearly as cool as a ninja, though." Sabo seemed befuddled by his answer, but the matter was swiftly dropped. "Your adventures are your own," he said after too long of awkward silence. "I want you to see it all with no spoilers." However, Luffy's mind was still caught up in the notion of giving some type of warning to his brothers. He wasn't sure if it would help anything, anyway. "That's a wonderful mindset, Luffy. You've grown into a fine boy," Makino muttered, with all the sweetness of sugar and melancholy of a widow by the shore. What she mourned, Luffy had no idea. "Though your eating habits haven't changed, I see." She laughed, her shoulders shaking with the action. All was right with the world, again, surrounded by the people Luffy would always treasure, even if this pocket of time no longer existed. It was bundled safe in his heart, regardless. Darkness draped over the land in waves, casting Ace's features in shadows, and Luffy watched, transfixed by the slow rise and fall of his chest. Alive, his mind supplied, but even after numerous days of living in the past, he hadn't quite accepted that fact. The blood of his brother still lay heavy against his skin. He could recall the drag of tears as they fell from Ace's paling eyes, life slowly drowning in a haze of fog. He shivered, pulling his legs closer to his chest. The fire crackled to life in front of him, taunting a reminder. The 3 brothers opted to sleep outside of their treehouse, by the fire. Luffy eagerly agreed any moment with his brothers was treasured. Not for the first time he pondered his situation. The concept of the past is a complicated matter, Robin had explained one evening, the words lost on Luffy then. In the case of Momo's mother, her devil fruit gave her the ability to transcend time and venture to the future. Not without consequences, as she could not return to her original timeline. Robin's smile had been warm and inviting, and it was largely the reason Luffy had remained and listened to her rant. She had been reading a novel, a heroine who'd found herself lodged in a time loop, of sorts. "Can we return to the past?" He recalled himself asking, blinking owlishly at the woman in front of him. Her hair had been pulled back, revealing sharp cerulean eyes. He wasn't exactly interested in the answer, more so, just loving the sound of his crew member's voice as it washed over him. Perhaps, there are several theories regarding the topic. There's a novelty in the notion of traveling to our past mistakes and righting them. She seemed unsure. If one can discard the barrier of time itself and travel to the future, that would suggest that time is like a stream. At Luffy's bewildered head tilt, she continued, it flows like water, constant, and with access to it, you might be able to dip into it at any point. But that suggests that each moment in history and the future is a fixed thing, destroying the illusion of choice in our narrative. Luffy had laughed then, saying something along the lines of, where's the freedom in that? Robin's rewarding smile had been soft, there is none. But, she contemplated her words with a hum, maybe, it's not a stream. It's hard to say there's no right or wrong answer regarding time, only speculation. Unfortunately, there are many theories surrounding it, that life is a loop, destiny, and free will. All social constructs, admittedly. But no concrete answers. What do you think? Robin's features grew lax. I think that it doesn't matter, our choices are our own. In spite of everything, the consequences are ours to bear. No amount of superficial discussion of time travel or the concept of its existence will fix the past. Her words weren't as heavy as they would have been 2 years ago, before Eni's lobby. But they still carried grief. But if I could, she trailed off, her gaze resting on the floor of the library. I might change some things, as long as I was assured I'd find you all, anyway. The words filled his head from 12 years into the future, ringing like a bell, but if I could, I might change some things. And just like that, the matter was settled. Luffy stretched out his legs, watching the fire flicker in the night. The buzzing of bugs hadn't left, only serving to fill the silence of the forest and remind him that he wasn't alone. Neither in the future nor the past. Luffy kicked Ace's leg and waited with bated breath, as Ace stirred with a groan. What? He asked, words coming out slurred. He shook his bangs from his face and gave a glance around the camping site, catching Luffy's waiting grin. Ace groaned, "VF, do you want?" Sabo was still asleep beside him, curled in a ball with nothing but a thin blanket covering his small frame. Instinctively, Ace fixed the blanket tighter around his younger brother. "Since when were you so soft?" Luffy teased, laughing at the red that grew along Ace's cheeks. "Shut up," he hissed between bared teeth. "I don't want to deal with a sick Sabo, he doesn't shut up." He fibbed and Luffy wondered how he missed this side of Ace, completely, growing up. It was so obvious how much he cared, even in his angst-filled years. Okay, Luffy conceded with a knowing smile. He stood, stretching out his arms above him. "Come on, I want to explore." "Explore?" Ace whispered, dismayed, pointedly darting his eyes to where the moon was high over their heads. "It's the middle of the night." He didn't disagree, however, as he stood and followed after Luffy. Ace's steps were tentative behind him, compared to Luffy's own, they were like a deer's. His stomach rumbled at the thought. Luffy didn't talk, letting the crisp air of night bite at their rosy skin. Beneath the moon's gaze, the natural path of the forest was illuminated. Luffy followed it, the crunch of leaves echoing in the abandoned forest. Ace was silent behind him, shifting with bewilderment and agitation at being woken up. Finally, Luffy found his words, not that he spent much time considering them. "Ace," it fell from his tongue with reverence, and from the hitch of Ace's breath, he knew something was amiss. "What?" He grouched, nonetheless. Because Luffy was fair regarding adventures, he asked, "Do you want to know about your future?" He wondered, idly, if the grief that lined his shoulders and weighed on his heart was as obvious to Ace as it was to Luffy. In his reflection, he could see it, ricocheted back at him, by the dimmer of his eyes and crinkle of his eyebrows. The set lips and tears forming at the edges of his vision. Grief, Nami had explained with care, it never leaves. It haunts you because it's your love, leftover, with nowhere to go, it trails you like a ghost. I thought my adventure was my own. Ace threw Luffy's words back at him and Luffy stopped, deciding to sit at a nearby boulder. He shuffled his legs to his chest and fixed his hat atop his head so that it shadowed his eyes. He didn't want Ace to see the making of tears in his stare. Ace sighed, sitting against the ground. He seized a leaf and began shredding it, idly. With far more patience than Luffy had expected, he waited for Luffy to speak. Luffy had always been selfish, it was in his nature to take what he wanted. And here, all that he could ever dream of, was before him, within his grasp, ready for the taking. How could Luffy not be greedy? He was a pirate, after all. You die in the future. Ace paused, hands foregoing the leaf as he whipped his head in alarm. Me? His voice came out strained. The light of the moon caught his face, enough so that Luffy could see the swirling of grief in Ace's black eyes. Luffy shrugged, recalling the weight of his brother's body against his, the blood that pooled from his lips, thank you for loving me. As though there was any other option for Luffy. He'd do it again and again if it meant that his brother would know love. Yeah, he mulled over Marineford. Should he tell Ace? Screw it, he thought, watching as his brother shifted nervously in front of him. So young, small, and alone. There was a war over you. They found out. Ace's eyes went wide and Luffy ducked his head in shame. So, I kicked the bucket because of that shitty old man? What bullshit. Luffy sighed, legs falling to hang over the edge of the rock. Ace's stare was fixated on his scar, breath catching as realization dawned on him. You mentioned a battle. Did it happen then? The meaning of his words was not lost on Luffy. Luffy winced, later. And it wasn't exactly a lie. It happened after Ace died. Ace bobbed his head, taking everything remarkably well, considering. Why are you telling me this, now? Ace seethed, fists clenching at his side. He remained seated. I was scared. It was easy, being honest with his big brother. 12 years into the future, Luffy had yet to truly change where it mattered. I have a future I want to return to. His crew, his family, they meant everything to him. But Ace Sabo, they meant everything to him also. They were his family too. And he could not sacrifice one for the other. Robin had said something about her book. The heroine's actions in the time loop had changed her future. How much was Luffy changing, having this conversation with Ace? Did he regret it? No. No, he didn't have regrets. Regardless, even the shifting of his future would not stop him from finding his crew again. They were his and he was theirs. You're leaving soon, right? Ace muttered, low amid the sound of crickets. I think I am. Ace heaved a breath. Tell me, was I a good brother? Luffy blinked, but without a second of thought, he blurted out. You were the best. Without Ace and Sabo, Luffy would have been crippled under the sheer weight of his loneliness as a child. Without them, he would have never survived. Ace rubbed his eyes raw. Yeah, good. I'd have kicked my future selves, but if he wasn't. Silence enveloped them and Luffy sat there, not for the first time, with bated breath. I know why you're telling me this. You want me to change it. To live. Ace hiccuped and like a bath of ice-cold water spilt over his head, Luffy realized he was sobbing. He stayed motionless, shocked to his core at the sight. The only time he'd seen his brother cry was when he died. I don't think I know how to live, Ace whispered. There were tears at the edge of his vision, but Luffy blinked them away. He was older, at this moment in time, and it was his duty to care for his brother. So, he did what came naturally and slipped to the ground beside Ace. He encompassed Ace in a hug, despite his protests, and kept him there. You'll find people, Ace, people that love you for who you are. He thought of Whitebeard and his son Sabo, and him. So many people loved Ace, now and in the future. If only he would realize that. You'll learn to live with them. A shaky sigh escaped Luffy's chapped lips. For now, you have Sabo and I. You'll always have us, Luffy wanted to say. But for now, he embraced his older brother. Ace melted at his touch and his labored breathing evened out, eventually. Since when did you grow up? Ace muttered, tersely. Luffy laughed, bubbly, next to Ace's ear and the boy winced away. He was scowling, his eyes red and cheeks blotchy with tear stains. Luffy didn't mention it. He thought of Sabo, in several months being shot down by a celestial dragon. He opened his mouth to mention it but decided not to. His brother would live and he'd find his people, even if it was a depressing PRD for both Luffy and Ace. They would grow from it. Nonetheless, Luffy said, watch out for Sabo, okay? I'm not going to be here. Perhaps, his warning would be taken to heart or not. He wasn't sure. Does he? No, it was the best reassurance Luffy could offer, well aware of what awaited the trio of brothers. Just, look out for each other? Ace huffed, pulling away entirely. Whatever. I know that. He stood up, stretching out his limbs with a yawn. Did you really wake me up for this? Yeah. Ace punched his shoulder, not bothering to refrain from using his full strength. Luffy didn't wince at it. Geez, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I miss when you were a crybaby. This whole tough act is weird. The jab appeared to do its job as Luffy began to trail after Ace's retreating back, pestering him over what he meant. He only received a mocking grin in response. The sixth day aboard the Red Force was bathed in lethargic hues of orange and pink, as the sun began to rise above the visible horizon and drape the once frosty air in humidity. Shanks did not relish in it like he typically would, as his forehead throbbed with a routine ache and his throat was parched. Flinching at the glimpse of light that skimmed his skin, he ducked his head. Beckman chuckled to his right. Shut up, he slurred, shifting away from the entrance to the captain's room, to stumble his way across the deck and avoid loose barrels strewn across the area with little care. Mindlessly, he noted to schedule for a cleaning day soon. His hand dragged across his face, the stubble along his jawline scratching his palm. Luffy's crew? Shanks muttered, eyeing his first mate. Beckman fixed his hair into a low ponytail with a hum, finding energy that Shanks envied, in the damp morning. He had drunk considerably less than Shanks and made sure to lord it over his head at every given chance, since waking up. Back on their ship? Their navigator Nami? Has started plotting their course. Shanks nodded, disregarding the dull ache of his heart as it resounded throughout his body. Melancholy was the feeling that echoed in his chest like an echo. He was not prepared to say goodbye to Luffy for a second time. Luffy's brother? Shanks wandered towards the railing, inspecting the lurching of water. The sea was eerily erratic, but that was standard for the New World. Stayed aboard, he fell asleep with Luffy. Shanks made a noncommittal sound, as he judged the waves with his head tilted to the left. Does he remind you of anybody? Beckman snorted, joining him and leaning against the railing. The position was familiar, as it was their typical morning routine. The life of a pirate was rarely peaceful, so they opted to revel in the moments when they came. Today, it came in the form of docile winds and wisps of cirrus clouds, waiting along the vast ocean of sky. With the backdrop of baby blue, Shanks found tranquility in its presence. Ace, Beckman said, somber. They're both Spitfires, he laughed, the sound hearty and thrumming with life. And with a flair for the dramatic. Shanks guffawed. Roger would have loved them. All of them. His words were hardly mournful, more so, reminiscing of the man who had shaped his childhood and the future of the world, too. He, too, always had a flair for the dramatic. Shanks could recall the buzz of laughter as the news crew flew in and delivered their newest bounties and report of the Roger pirates' latest escapades. He could remember it, like yesterday, Roger's broad grin and pride gleaming in his wide eyes as he boasted about the wanted posters of his crew, his family. 2 more days, right? Beckman muttered, leaning away from the railing. How can we be so sure the information Nico Robin collected was accurate? Shanks' lips canted down. They were dry. There's no way to verify. I think it's safe to say the devil fruit user is dead, however. If our Luffy is not back by the week's end, we'll employ our efforts elsewhere. Look into locating the devil fruit, or other fruits that may return Luffy to his crew. Beckman nodded, his eyebrows drawn together in complex emotion. Right. Should I inform the crew? Shanks glowered at the rocketing water below. No, let's keep it under wraps, for now. No need to cause anxiety. His hair, slick with oil, fell in waves across his vision as he ducked his head. Let's hope Lucky Roo has started breakfast by now. Beckman chuckled, with a crooked smirk, pretty sure he's just as hungover as you. Shanks groaned in answer. Luffy burst from the door with vigor, pouring into the kitchen with a grin and a tall, blond man at his heel. Sabo, come on, he called out with a giggle, as he directed Sabo to sit at Shanks' table with little care for the concept of etiquette. No one commented on it. I'm hungry, he cried, sparing a hand to steal from Shanks' plate and eat his food. He disregarded Shanks' futile protest and Sabo's swatting hand, his brilliant laughter ringing boldly in the ship's galley. Good morning, Sabo greeted with a small smile. He bowed, before leaving to collect numerous plates for Luffy and him. Shanks watched him leave, his long trench coat billowing with his swift pace. G'morning, Shanks. Luffy yawned, shifting on the wooden bench as he leaned across the table to sneak another slice of bacon. Shanks let him. Sleep well? Shanks prodded, shoveling down omelets before Luffy's grubby hands could seek them out and eat them. The best. I missed Sabo. Luffy was eager to divulge the events of last night, the ones which Shanks had gracelessly forgotten. Robin knew Sabo, did you know that? Shanks' lips tipped up, leaning his head against his fist. No, I didn't. Like a domino effect, Luffy flew into stories of Sabo and Robin's adventures. Some of them were familiar, things he'd heard in passing from the weekly newspaper, others were jarring. It would seem the revolutionaries were hard at work. Not that he had expected any less from Dragon, and by extension, Sabo. And Robin, he supposed, for the 2 years she had been separated from her crew. A gloved hand ruffled Luffy's messy locks, a dry chuckle escaping Sabo as he sat down and placed a plate in front of Luffy. Luffy brightened at the sight of the plate that was loaded with bacon, eggs, sausages, just about anything on their food menu, really. Were you boring Shanks with stories? Luffy huffed, cheeks bulging like a chipmunk as he predictably began stuffing his face. Shanks stifled a snort at the sight. Not boring. Luffy mumbled around the clumps of food contained in his mouth. In tandem, Shanks and Sabo cringed away. Eat with your mouth closed, Shanks said, upon instinct. Again, he found it easy to fall into the same pace of the past. He supposed it made sense. Luffy was still the same boy he had left on the lonely shores of Goa Kingdom. Luffy pouted in response. Shanks turned his analyzing gaze on Sabo, catching the lack of his own plate. Not eating? He pet an eyebrow, watching as Sabo gave a blank blink down at the empty table space. I will. Figured it smarter to wait for Luffy to have his fill. You know how he gets, bobbing his head to Shanks' emptying plate. Which yeah, Shanks could not disagree with that sentiment. Nonetheless, he shoved his plate forward, ignoring the eyes of his first mate, watching and judging. Nonsense. Here, take this. You're a guest and Luffy's brother. No one goes hungry here. Shanks proclaimed, with a firm shake of his head. Distantly, he reminded himself to take a shower, the oily strands of his hair becoming uncomfortably stiff. Such is life at sea, he supposed. Before Sabo could protest, seemingly carrying some semblance of manners between the three brothers, Shanks continued, besides, think of it as a bribe. Sabo halted, raising his eyebrow inquisitively. A bribe? He echoed, suspicion shrouding his words. Beckman shifted next to him, bewildered too. Shank did not pay it any mind, having already made his mind up on the matter, a rather impulsive decision, on his part, but he was not known for having drawn out battle plans of conquering or thinking things through, for that matter. He simply existed, following the tide of the ocean and the natural call of adventure, it sang, only seeing it fit to step in when the world called for it. As was Roger's way of perceiving the world, so was it Shanks'. From what Robin has divulged, Luffy has 2 days left until he returns to the past, forever out of Shanks' grasp. Sabo stiffened, across from him, Luffy none the wiser. Or more so, he did not care for their conversation. Even if it centered around him. He was far too enamored by the heap of food before him. And you want to, what, exactly? There was that protective streak that Shanks had expected, rising to burst free like a concealed house fire. The second the door was opened, all hell would break loose. And while Shanks was confident in his abilities, he was less sure that his ship could bear the sheer destruction the Paramecia no Mi could perform, if used wisely. Not that he was going to tiptoe around Sabo. The protectiveness, while anticipated, was entirely unnecessary. Shanks would not dare dream of harming a hair on Luffy's head. Shanks' gaze darted to his first mate, who sat eyeing him with a guarded stare, curious but weary as to Shanks' plans. His scrutiny was warranted, admittedly. Shanks had a tendency to find trouble, and paired with Luffy, the two were a troublesome pair, for lack of descriptive words. Spend time with him. He offered, shrugging his shoulders. There wasn't much to it, in reality. He wanted to quench the yearning of his heart, to fill the gaping hole that had been carved out with Luffy's absence, all these years. Even if it was only for a day. 5 days were not enough for Shanks, not enough for a man that had long since realized his position in the world, a mere stepping stone for Luffy to become king, for him to lead the world to a new dawn. His days were limited, and with the inevitable reunion weighing over his head like the blade of an executioner's, he found himself longing for the familiar wisps of memories that filter through his consciousness, occasionally. Of days long since past, of a time so far and out of his reach, that now faced with it, in the form of a boy no taller than Shanks' knees, he yearned. In a way, he didn't think himself capable. Shanks had always been sentimental, like that. Sabo's lips curved down, but before he could protest the idea of separating from his kid brother, who lived in constant danger as a child living in the new world with a bounty tied to his name, Luffy spoke up. I want to spend time with Shanks, he announced, a bright grin overtaking his features. Unfortunately, for both Sabo and Shanks, they were naturally weak to the sight. Sabo gave a mere heartbeat after, with a reluctant sigh. I guess, if Luffy is safe with anyone, it would be an emperor. He snuck a bite of bacon, with sluggish movements. Still, if anything happens, you'll skewer me and cook me alive like a kebab, I know. Shanks snorted, having already predicted Sabo's thinly concealed threats. They were far from empty, just rather pointless, considering Shanks' stature. Not that he would tell Sabo that and goad the man into attempting his plots. He did not doubt in his mind that Sabo could be as much of a spitfire as Ace had, at least, according to Whitebeard's boastful accounts. He would, preferably, like to live the remainder of his days without his name underlined in red in the Chief of Staff's books. Some things he could decidedly live without. Sabo smirked. I was going to suggest the use of my dragon claw, he flexed his hand pointedly, but that works too. Shanks guffawed at the man's lack of shame. He was certainly Luffy's brother, all right. Then it's settled. Shanks joyfully declared, ignoring Beckman's probing stare. Another matter, for another day, Shanks decided. Luffy was, admittedly, an excitable boy. This, of course, Shanks had not forgotten. In fact, it haunted him through the years, his mind never seeming to forget the moments in which Luffy had drawn them into embarrassing situations, simply because he was curious about the makings of the world. Thus, naturally, Luffy held that same care, or, more so, lack of care, when he dragged Shanks through the village of the island, letting out odd gasps as he pointed at various structures. Shanks supposed he could understand his energy. For the entirety of his 7 years of life, He had been confined to the while riveting and beautiful with its tranquil green plains and rustic buildings dreary and boring landscape of Goa Kingdom. It surely had gotten old, fast. And the island they had docked at was of new buildings and even fresher people. The general building style was similar to Wano's if only lacking in bright colors. Ruby red roofs and white buildings were common in the small shoreside village. Alongside the tiled roofs and raised houses were also a mix of farmhouses, with their thatched roofs and wooden exteriors. Luffy marveled at the sight of them, just the same, even commenting on the lack of windmills. Shanks chuckled at the boy's antics. Finally, Luffy voiced a question that had Shanks halting. So, what now? Right, the novelty of a new village was sure to wear off, eventually. It was only a question of when with Luffy. Shanks hummed, eyeing the village with a pensive expression. Finally, he opted to stop a woman, clad in a coat of white floral patterns. She stilled and eyed him with a curious stare. Excuse me, would there happen to be any tourist locations? He flashed a dazzling smile and watched as the woman practically swooned in response, blushing sweetly as she hastily nodded. Yes, up that way. She pointed behind her, with a furrowed brow. If you take a left and follow a dirt path, you'll find the shrine to our god. She spoke with a southern drawl, her big brown eyes blinking at Shanks. Please be respectful. Of course, Shanks said, tilting his head to the boy who stood innocently at his side. I just wanted to give him a tour of your town. He offered, with a loose shrug. She nodded, sympathetically, and gave a smile of her own to Luffy, who eagerly returned it. Thank you, he said in farewell as the woman scurried off, and Shanks turned to follow her directions. A shrine? Luffy questioned, trailing after Shanks. He had to run to keep pace with Shanks' longer strides. Shanks held back a laugh at the sight. It was fortunate that the island they had happened to dock at was both inhabited and worthy of exploring, otherwise, it would have been fruitless to drag Luffy away from their ships. And a shrine was as good as any activity to pass their day with. Some people worship gods. He thought of Luffy's current bounty poster, the fluffy white of his hair and his unnaturally wide grin. He did not bring it up, however, allowing the thought to float away along with the rest of his mindless ideas. Luffy's nose wrinkled adorably as he quickened his gait to remain by Shanks' side. Why? Shanks shrugged, fixing his coat tighter around his missing arm. Closure? Peace, just for the sake of it out of duty, or because they want to? He divulged, not that he expected Luffy to properly digest anything he was saying. Any number of reasons why, really. Luffy kicked at a stray pebble, quiet at Shanks' hip, then. Do you worship anyone, Shanks? Shanks, to his credit, did not falter, but he did pause. For a heartbeat, he stumbled, but like it never happened, he continued walking, veering Luffy to the street on the left at the lady's direction. Did he worship anyone? What a loaded question. Maybe. Maybe, if circumstances were different. But as it stood and with his knowledge of both the future and past, he found the answer was easy. No, not really. Luffy blew his tongue in response. Boring. He concluded, waving his arms around, dramatically. They flailed slightly, what with them being rubber and all. But Luffy did not blink at it, so neither did Shanks. A dry chuckle escaped Shanks' dry lips. What about you, Luffy? Though, he figured the answer was quite obvious. Do you worship anyone? Last he recalled, there hadn't been a predominant religion in Windmill Village, or Goa Kingdom, to begin with. The people were rather reclusive, choosing to mind their own business with each of Shanks' visits until it became clear that he wasn't disappearing. Eventually, they left their shell and interacted with him, having even been present when Shanks last departed from the sands of Goa Kingdom. But he had never gotten the religious vibe from the small cluster of people, just a friendly, welcoming aura of good-natured folk. Nope. Luffy said as he eyed the houses they passed with wavering intrigue. I just want to explore. Shanks bit back a sigh, having predicted this outcome. Luffy wasn't the type to give such things a minute of his time, not that he held any real contempt for those who did, he merely lacked any care for the whole thing. That is, until the dirt path expanded and they came across the entrance of the shrine. An orange and black torii gate. Luffy gasped at the sight, running to inspect the ancient wood with a grin. Careful, he said, quick to pull Luffy back. We have to bow before we enter. Luffy huffed, why? It's a show of respect. He instructed Luffy on a proper bow, watching as the boy folded his body in half. Good, now walk to the side. Again, Luffy questioned him with furrowed eyebrows. The space in the middle is reserved for the gods to walk. Luffy let out a dramatic sigh but did as he was told, for once, walking to the left of the torii gate. Inside, past the grand structure of the torii, they were greeted by two identical statues of lions, their fierce mane painstakingly carved alongside their relaxed features. The stone was old and weathered but bore no sign of negligence. It was on each side of the entrance and Luffy brightened at their presence. Shanks nudged him forward to where a fountain lay to the right of the entrance and instructed him on the process of purifying oneself before properly entering the shrine. He did not seem to understand the whole ordeal but followed the direction with great care, mostly because of Shanks' stern stare. They moved on swiftly from that, following the man-made path deeper into the woods until they eventually stumbled across the main offering hall. Like many of the buildings in the village, the roof was painted red tiles and a wooden exterior, but it was without a doubt far more extensively embellished than the others. With the lowly hung lanterns and the dimly lit exterior, and the inherent need to paint every surface with a spiral pattern of gold, Luffy's eyes traced it all, just the same, catching on the raised platform and open doors. Before he could pour in, Shanks was quick to drag his hat so it rested against his back and told him to take off his shoes, lest they be perceived as disrespectful. Luffy did so with a grumble, resting his sandals on the front porch and stepping in, thankfully having worn a pair of spare socks today. Shanks followed his lead, trailing after Luffy, far more reserved. He had visited countless shrines over the years, having sailed to numerous places. This was nothing new. Not that he would tell Luffy that. "This place is so cool," Luffy exclaimed, and Shanks winced at his loud voice. Thankfully, no one was around to scold them. He eyed the inside with gleaming eyes. The offering hall was kept tidy, with not a speck of dirt spotted upon its surfaces. To the left of Shanks was an Emma, small papers posted to the wooden piece, in copious amounts. And in front of them, the offering basket stood proud. Shanks pushed Luffy forward, gently. He offered some berry to Luffy, and said, "Watch how I do it and repeat it, okay?" Luffy nodded, vigorously. Standing to the side of the offering basket, Shanks bowed and gently placed a handful of berry inside. He then proceeded to bow twice, and for the next action, he opted to clap his shoulder instead of his hands. Then, finally, keeping his hand against his shoulder, he ducked his head and prayed, for safe travels, for his crew and Luffy's crew, and that Luffy would return to his crew, safe and sound. He bowed, again, and backed away from the offering. "Clap your hands instead of your shoulder, and make sure your right hand is lower than your left." Luffy gave him a thumbs up, and to Shanks' utter astonishment, he followed Shanks' instructions nearly perfectly. His bows were a tad bit brisk, but there were no prying eyes, so Shanks let it pass. Luffy's eyes were scrunched, his eyebrows drawn together in a knot of worry as he presumably prayed. What he prayed for, Shanks had the barest of ideas. But he watched on, fascinated by the slope of pudgy cheeks and rounded nose. How young he looked, swathed in shadows and the warm hues of candles. His hair, midnight black, framed his face and only made him appear more youthful if that were possible. It was hard to place this face with the one that filled wanted posters and accomplished previously believed impossible feats, raising Eni's lobby to the ground, ending not only Doflamingo's tyranny but also Kaido and Big Mom's. One feat after another, some of Luffy's adventures surely Shanks was not even aware of, himself. He sighed, wistfully. Luffy abruptly stood straighter, before bowing himself, the movement jerky and wild as he whirled on Shanks with a grin. "What now?" Shanks pet an eyebrow in thought, casting a glance around. There were many things of note in the shrine, but hardly any that would keep Luffy's attention. So, he opted to direct Luffy back to the exit and to the Torii Gate, where they bowed once more and left to trail the well-maintained path in the forest. "What did you pray for?" Shanks asked, poking at the baby fat-filled cheek. Luffy swatted at him with a scoff. He pursed his lips, "For Ace," he said, casually, like it hadn't swept the rug from out under Shanks and caused his gait to falter, entirely. He was frozen, in response. Luffy continued for several seconds until he realized the adult at his side was no longer there. He turned, perplexed, watching Shanks with a befuddled expression. Shanks held no rebuttal. "What's wrong?" "Why?" He almost didn't want to ask. "Why Ace?" Luffy's stare was long and hard. And for the first time, since meeting Luffy on that fateful day, all the way past the chaos of the Grandline, in the waters of the East Blue, Shanks could not place the expression that overtook Luffy's supple features. "Shanks is acting weird." Luffy's frown was etched uncomfortably into his gum-like skin, unnatural upon his face, and Shanks instinctively hated it. Hated it just the same as he loathed the 3 scars that marred his left eye. He could not find words to reply with, lost on his tongue as he stared uselessly at a boy who came to his knees in height. Who still held all the power to make Shanks hesitate. Shanks' stomach churned with something: guilt, grief, sadness. Whatever it was, it became a knot of emotions, curling in him, threatening to burst. Because stood before him was a boy long since gone, a figment of the past who was unaware of what woes the future had weaved for him, who had yet to be NTMT with the notion of life so crudely snuffed out by the brutal, gaudy hands of fate. Luffy was yet to know grief, and for that, Shanks was also thankful and cursing the very nature of the world. A man should know the pain and grueling makings of reality, but not a child, not the boy who stood in front of him, untouched and unmarred by the wicked ways of this world. Who had yet to know the feeling of blood not of his own seeping through his fingers, powerless to stop the inevitable claws of death from sinking its fingers into his most treasured. Shanks, himself, was all too familiar with the face of death. And eventually, he would meet it face to face. But not Luffy, never Luffy. He did not deserve to know its existence. Yet, he would. And there was nothing that could be done. Nothing that Shanks could do. That was the truth of the matter. What was done was done. A small hand poked at his cheek, skimming the stubble along his jaw. It brought Shanks back from his stupor. What's wrong, Shanks? Luffy probed, having scaled Shanks like a jungle gym to prod at Shanks like a dead rodent. Shanks shut his mouth that had unintentionally opened, working his jaw back into place as he let out a chuckle, lacking any real amusement. Nothing, just surprised you prayed for anything useful. Luffy let out an indignant squawk, flailing his fists in offense, to which Shanks caught and settled back against his coat. He carefully adjusted Luffy against him, the position familiar. Luffy's rear now rested on Shanks' arm as he opted to carry Luffy the rest of the way. You're mean. Luffy huffed, gripping Shanks' coat like his life depended on it. Shanks didn't mention it. Whatever you say, kid. It was times like this that Shanks missed his other hand, not for combat and not for common day tasks, those he could manage just fine. But for the simple things, like having a spare hand to ruffle Luffy's locks. But he made do, just as he had every time he missed the appendage, and jostled Luffy's hair with his chin, a content smile adorning his features. Shanks, I'm hungry. There was that insatiable appetite. Yeah, I hear you. The path opened up to the town and Shanks followed the road until he stumbled upon a ramen shop and sat Luffy down at one of the empty tables. Luffy was eager to order a mountain's worth of food and Shanks let him, idly ordering a portion to go for Luffy's brother. Having fun? Shanks asked, resting his cheek against his palm. Luffy beamed, with a mouthful of noodles between his lips. He swallowed them swiftly. Yup. I haven't had ramen since Ace and Sabo brought me to this ramen shop in, High Town, I think. Shanks raised an eyebrow at that. Several minutes later, he waved his hand for the bill and paid for it, barely glancing at the number of berry owed. He stood, taking the takeout container and watched as Luffy made quick work of his remaining bowl. They sat by the window and with a glance, Shanks found the sun beginning to set. He sighed, ushering Luffy outside of the shop and directed him back to the road. All right, time to head back, he said with reluctance. Luffy was skipping along the gravel road, quiet for the first time, ever. Shanks cast a fatigued look down at the boy. For Ace, echoed in Shanks' head like a bell. His heartbeat stuttered. The contents of Luffy's prayer remained a mystery, and as for why he felt drawn to pray for his brother, Shanks did not want to consider the thought. Shanks, Luffy said, his eyes glued to the ground beneath him. Shanks hummed, yeah? Luffy fixed his hat atop his hair, bathing his face in shadows as he shifted his head to observe Shanks. The scar below his left eye was pinkish and Shanks could recall the day Luffy had stabbed himself, giving Shanks a heart attack in the process. He hoped Luffy had dropped that habit since then. I'll see you again, right? Shanks blinked, perplexed. What do you mean? I broke our promise. Oh. Having not realized the state that he had put Shanks in, Luffy merely continued walking at a leisurely pace at his side, occasionally kicking at a rock in his way. Shanks exhaled in relief, feeling the tension along his shoulders loosen. He had quite honestly expected Luffy to bring up Ace again. And he wasn't sure how he would respond to it, this time around. You're not a pirate, yet, Luffy. I wouldn't worry about that. Luffy eyed him. Do I see you, again? Are you asking me to spoil your adventure? Luffy pursed his lips, glancing away. No. Shanks is right. Don't tell me. Shanks huffed a laugh, but Luffy was hardly done talking. I hope I get to say goodbye. Shanks gave him a confused look, to which Luffy responded with flushed cheeks. Embarrassed. It's just I'm supposed to be leaving, right? And I'll see them again. But I want to say goodbye, anyway. That's unlike you. Luffy wasn't the type for goodbyes. That much was clear when Shanks departed from Goa Kingdom and left Luffy behind. Luffy rubbed his cheeks. An adorable frown upon his lips. I'll miss them. I miss my Ace and Sabo, but this Sabo is so cool. He has fire powers. And my crew, they're all so awesome. I have a robot. And a bone man. And a meanie with swords, a raccoon dog too. Luffy was jumping around, animated as ever as he listed off one crew member after the next, his reverence for each not lost on Shanks. It would seem Luffy's adoration for his crew was not distinct to only his present self. Shanks smiled at the thought. And the grave robber, she reads me stories, the fish guy has been teaching me his moves. For demonstration, he moved his palm forward. Oh, and I have a sniper. How cool is that? Very. Shanks supplied, in amusement. Nami is scary, but she also gave me some of her tangerines. And Sanji's food is so good. I can't wait to grow up and meet them. I know Ace and Sabo will be jealous when I tell them. Shanks guffawed. I'll say, Anchor, you picked out some good ones. Luffy practically glowed at the praise, even if it was technically directed at his future self. I did. Luffy exclaimed with a proud nod, practically bouncing toward the docks of the island. Shanks trailed after him with a slower gait, less eager to return to the Red Force. But their time was running low and he would not deprive the rest of Luffy's crew and his brother of Kid Luffy time, as he had since dubbed it. Upon venturing back onto the ship, Sabo was quick to scoop Luffy in his arms and swing him around, with a cry of, Luffy. Luffy burst into giggles, swatting at Sabo in protest. Put me down. Luffy shrieked, ignorant to the muffled chuckles of onlookers. Sabo followed his command with a grin, setting the boy on the ground and patting his straw hat. Sorry, Luffy, he said, not sounding remotely apologetic. Shanks didn't comment on that, however, as he strolled by the duo of brothers and ignored Sabo's prying gaze. He found Beckman by the railing, where they had met that morning. Shanks settled at his first mate's side, watching as Luffy proceeded to voice his day's adventure to everyone willing to listen, which was, about everyone. So, how was it? Shanks snorted, I'm going to miss him. He confessed, shocked at his own honesty. If Beckman was surprised at the admittance, he did not let it show. He fingered his cigarette, in thought, before. He's not gone, you know? Shanks frowned. Then why did it feel like he was losing a part of himself, all over again? Look, I don't know your motivations, Shanks side-eyed the man. I know that it's got something to do with your captain, that's fine. I won't pry, but you're not losing him. I know. Shanks closed his eyes, feeling the tug of the wind as it whipped at him, his coat billowing at its shove. I know, I'm not. But as the tides changed and the future shifted, Shanks knew otherwise. The world was preparing for a new era, one that would surely be led by Luffy. There would be no time for moments like these, ever again. And how his heart yearned for this, the domesticity of having Luffy aboard the Red Force, always eager for the next adventure. He had accepted this outcome years ago, but fate was cruel in giving him a glimpse of what could have been, had he gone against his captain's final orders. Not that he was willing to change the past. But the heart was a weak thing, always longing for things out of its reach. He would never have Luffy as the son he should have been, merely the head of the upcoming revolution. Good, Beckman muttered, terse as he watched Luffy jump around the ship. His eyes were gleaming with fondness and Shanks' heart broke, for what felt like the second time today. What could have been, lingered in the background of his mind, a haunting thought. The seventh day was uneventful, if only tense with energy. Everyone was aware of the looming deadline. The Straw Hats were aboard, now, gathered together as they traded stories with the red-haired pirates and chatted amongst themselves. Always, one of them kept their eyes trained on Luffy. Shanks could not blame them. He too tracked the kid, as he switched between people, with his brother at his beck and call. Amusing, the sight of the 6 feet 2 inches man trailing helplessly after his little brother. Eventually, Luffy found himself stumbling over to Shanks with a wide grin and eager hands. Shanks listened easily and lifted Luffy with his one arm. "Good morning to you too," Shanks murmured, concealing the anxiety that gripped his frame like a glove. "Morning," Luffy said, pulling at Shanks' hair. "Your hair is longer," he murmured, casting a glance at Shanks before turning to look at his brother. "It's longer than Sabo's." Luffy's small hand, lined with baby fat, dropped to grasp the collar of Shanks' shirt. "I like it. Do I grow my hair out like yours?" It was Sabo who responded, "No," as he swiped Luffy from Shanks and threw him over his shoulder. "Now stop bothering the captain," he set Luffy down on the deck. You know what? How about you go and find that book you borrowed from Robin? We still have to return that." Luffy gasped, realization dawning as he bolted from the group of men and down below deck, where his temporary room was situated. Sabo exhaled, exhaustion curling along his body. His shoulders drooped as he turned on Shanks, watching, evaluating. Shanks offered an olive branch in the form of a greeting, "Sabo." A loose, tired smile was the response he garnered. "Thank you for the ramen, by the way. You didn't have to." His eyes darted away, contemplative. "I think Luffy knows." Shanks froze at this. "Knows?" he echoed, sparing a peek behind the blonde, finding that Luffy still had not returned. He breathed a sigh of relief. "Ace?" Sabo gave a shaky nod. "Yeah. I know him, he's an idiot, but he's remarkably perceptive of others around him. Even as a kid." Sabo leaned against a barrel behind him. "I remember that. He knew Ace and I better than we did." His frosty blue eyes were shadowed, as he ducked his head. The frail blonde locks framed his face and concealed his sharp features. "I don't know for sure, but last night, he told me." About the shrine, the prayer. Shanks' face fell. Yeah. He prayed for him. Sabo's face appeared pinched, concern bleeding into his words as he said, exactly. I don't know what clued him in or if he's aware, to begin with. He would have been more subdued, right? If he knew about Ace, right? A tinge of panic was overtaking Sabo, as he raked his hand through his hair. Sheet, did we F up? If when he returns, do you think he'll change the future? Do we want that? Shanks, admittedly, had not considered that possibility. The chance that Luffy could be capable of changing the future, however slim it was, with only assumptions of the future. There was still a sliver of a possibility. His hand fidgeted with his coat, he doesn't have the means to do so, anyway. Even if he knows, he doesn't know the how or why. Shanks shook his head. Luffy, then, was in no position to save Ace. And he won't be, no matter what he tries to change. That was the unfortunate truth of reality. Fate had been written long before their hearts had sung for the first time. Have you seen Luffy? A gruff, monotone voice said to his left. Zoro, Shanks recognized. Shanks peered at him in unison with Sabo, the both of them having been shocked from their tense conversation of what-ifs. That was what they were, potential scenarios. I sent him downstairs, he'll be back any minute. Sabo divulged with a minuscule smile. Zoro nodded briskly, giving them an odd look as he left to walk below deck. Sabo turned back to him. Look, you're probably right. I just worry. This is my brother. His remaining brother, Shanks' mind helpfully supplied. It's fine. I admire your loyalty to Luffy, I'm happy he's found such reliable brothers. He only wished the three of them had had more time together. But his wishes were wasted on moments that had long since passed. The sound of stumbling boots reverberated across the deck, echoing over the loud chatter aboard the Red Force. A head of mint green hair stood out as he exclaimed. Luffy's gone. The banal noise of pouring rain was innocuous, yet it grated against Luffy's ears all the same. The taste of petrichor on his tongue, foretelling a long night of gloomy gray skies and frigid weather, accompanied by roaring thunder overhead. He could feel it looming over him, the inevitable of it all. Echoes of shifting behind him, a heavy weight against the rotten wood beneath, but Luffy feigned ignorance of it as he gave a weary exhale and watched the splatter of rainfall against the window. As the droplets cascaded against the grimy surface of glass, his eyes traced them, his days were numbered. His grandfather, a man dragged down by the continuous waves of time ever moving, never waiting for others to catch up, had suggested his visit to the past would last at the most a week. Luffy's mistake was in not counting the days. He had thought it meaningless to waste the very few hours he was afforded with his brothers, whole, alive and together, by tallying each minute lost. A disservice to spend his time on anything but Ace and Sabo, really. That same sound this time shuffling, shoes scraping against hardwood, loud as it reverberated in the barren room. Once upon a time, this had been Ace and Luffy's room. And while it had never been embellished with furniture, it had always thrummed with life, examples of the two children who occupied it. Sure, the floors creaked under the barest amounts of weight and the walls were made up of peeling wallpaper and decaying wood and the window Luffy solemnly gazed out of was smudged with dirt. But it was home, just the same as their treehouse. It was home in the way that the scent of freshly baked pie from Makino was home. He knew where to sleep to avoid the protruding nails and he could recognize his crayon scribbles furiously drawn along the walls. Some of them were Sabo's two artworks of humanoid figures, frolicking along grassy plains with a large yellow orb, the sun, in the background. It was home, merely because of the love that had once inhabited these flimsy walls. If he focused hard enough, he could recall the youthful laughter that once used to echo in this room, stripped of all its character as it was now. Wisps of memories danced along the forefront of his mind, curling around each other and displaying images of two bright grins, untethered glee, shared dreams, nightly bedtime stories of grand adventures across the seas. All of them carried a tinge of fondness, adoration, and the naive sparkle of childhood idealism. Someone cleared their throat and Luffy sighed, his gut twisting uncomfortably as he reluctantly turned to the newcomer. The sight of his grandfather did not surprise him, standing tall in all his imposing glory. His face, ridden with wrinkles though fewer compared to his future counterpart and a frown seemingly permanently etched across his rugged features. His scar, carved along his left eye, was red and ugly. Luffy had never asked where he had garnered it from, always working under the assumption that it was at the hands of a mighty beast. Brat. Garp said, somber as he leant against the decrepit door. Any more weight and it might crumble beneath him. Ace is looking for you. He inclined his head, watching with his typical blithe nature. Almost bored by the cadence of his voice. But Luffy knew better than to think that. He reclined against the window, the chilling touch soothing his nerves. I know. He murmured, finding that his limbs were drooping with every passing second, exhaustion. His heart was tired, familiarly. 2 years ago, no, 10 years into the future? It ached for a brother long since dead. Even now, this Ace 10, lacking childhood innocence but still so naive to what lay before him, carved into his future was not the Ace that Luffy knew. This Ace was merely an individual who had existed in his recollections, a figment of the past, long buried beneath the more recent memories of Ace. An Ace he loved all the same, but only left his heart hollow with yearning for a man dead in the past and the future. "Why are you here, then?" Garp, always lacking any tact, much like the rest of his family, questioned. "You've been glued by the hips since you got here." He snorted, fiddling in the pocket of his jeans until he produced a bag of crackers. Idly, he ate them, peering down at Luffy with an unidentifiable emotion swirling within his big, brown eyes. Too similar to Luffy's own. Luffy shrugged, unperturbed by Garp's comment. He adjusted the borrowed Hawaiian shirt along his collarbone. No reason, he attempted to lie, fully aware that it was a worthless endeavor. Usopp had always been the skilled liar amongst the crew, Luffy the worst of them all. He had never had a reason to. "Fine, be like that," Garp muttered, not unkindly. He wasn't evidently particularly invested in their conversation, by the impassive way in which he snacked across from Luffy. Silence draped over grandfather and grandson, the mellow atmosphere between them akin to a gaping chasm. And not for the first time since being hurled into the past, Luffy watched Garp with trepidation. An uneasy feeling enveloped his heart, the organ stuttering as the quiet persisted. Garp made no move in breaking it, just waiting for Luffy to confess to the thoughts that sullied his mind. It was oddly patient for the man, who, as far back as Luffy could recall, had never had an ounce of patience to spare. Well? There it was. His tolerance had worn thin. "I'm not getting any younger." Luffy snorted despite himself, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He slid against the wall until he was sitting comfortably with his knees nestled close to his chest. "The future," Luffy trailed off, hardly understanding what he wanted to say. What could he say to his grandfather that would change his mind? Stubbornness was a family trait, after all. "Gramps, did you ever regret becoming a Marine?" Garp, to his credit, did not startle at the question. The only reaction he gave was a twitch of an eyelid, and it was gone the next second as he brushed Luffy off with a shrug. "Why would I?" At Luffy's imploring stare, he continued with a scowl fixed onto his face. "Being a Marine is the right thing to do. This world, it's filled with evil. Pirates run rampant, they think they can do whatever they want. This world needs order." His words were final and there was little Luffy could offer in argument of them. He had never been good with politics, anyway. Never had the time to care for the intricate details of both sides of the conflict between the Navy and pirates. Why would he? It was all superficial to him, his dream merely lay in freedom. And being a pirate was the key to real freedom. Manifested into existence by sailing the seas, with his crew, his most loyal, at his side. That was freedom to Luffy, the euphoria of living with no rules, no responsibilities, to chain him to one place. The only oath sworn by the wind at the sails and the sea rocking against his ship was the promise of adventure. "I don't get it." Luffy shrugged, uncaring of the indignant shout he received in response. "I mean, there are bad Marines and good pirates, right?" Luffy's lips pursed into a pout. "Do you think, if we became pirates, we'd deserve the same punishment? Like Gold Roger?" It was unfair, maybe. Garp did not know the context of Luffy's words, but then, his grandfather had always been intelligent. In his own eccentric way. "You're not going to become pirates. I'll make sure of that. Double your training exercises. I knew I shouldn't have gone easy on you brats," Garp declared with a scoff as he shook the now empty bag of crackers for crumbs. He let them fall into his gaping maw. "But what if we do?" Garp's eyebrows furrowed into a knot. Pensive. "Why were you asking?" Suspicion smothered his words, as he glared down at Luffy. His grandson did not cower, showing just how much he changed in the years to come. It was almost impressive, if it hadn't clearly set Garp off. Uncertain of what would escape his lips, Luffy kept his mouth shut. Maybe it should have been words fueled with rage, grief, over their shared loss, the one that Garp had stubbornly stood on the sidelines for. However, Luffy found himself incapable of being angry with his grandfather. They had all made their choices long ago, and while Ace's hand had been forced with the revelation of who his blood father was, their fates were long sealed before this. Ace was a pirate, Garp was a Marine. Naturally, their paths were at cross with each other. And unfortunately, a pirate's grim fate was not to be mistaken for anything but the skeletal hands of an angel pulling them from the wreckage of what was the end of a life. Death was the only promise in their lives. This Luffy had come to learn in the most devastating way possible. "What would you do?" Luffy reiterated, forcing as much steel into his words to make his point clear. He would not budge. And to his surprise, Garp relented. He sighed, that same sigh, tired, coming from somewhere deep within as he collapsed against the door and sat, crossed-legged, mirroring his grandson across from him. "What would I do?" Garp muttered, staring listlessly up at the caving ceiling. And for the life of him, Luffy could not glean the inner thoughts of Garp's mind. "As a vice-admiral, it is in my jurisdiction to apprehend criminals." His eyes fell upon Luffy, dark and brooding, a storm brewing at the edges of his irises. That would extend to family. Luffy did not feel an icy shock at the statement. In fact, he had not expected anything less from his grandfather, who remained steadfast in his loyalty to the Navy. And as a grandfather? It slipped from his tongue, unbitten. Luffy's eyes widened, bewildered by his own question. Stuck in an enclosed room with his grandfather, who appeared far younger than he should be, the man of his childhood, who was rough around the edges, who loved him by training him. Luffy fell back into that version of himself, a lonely child with only his grandfather and a handful of villagers at his side. Who cried, craving connection, who was so eager to have the warmth of love that he sought it out in the form of a pirate crew upon the sandy shores of Windmill village. A child who yearned for his grandfather's love, as destructive as it was. "I'd want to keep you boys alive," was the damning confession, shattering whatever had been shielding Luffy's heart these past few days from breaking. A wave of sorrow washed over him, drowning him as he came to a startling realization. He hadn't had the time to unpack Marineford in its entirety, a war swarming with foes and allies alike, that it had not stuck out to him. He had been so hyper-focused on saving Ace that nothing else mattered. But Garp had let him through, then. On the makeshift bridge, up to his brother. He had let his hit land, and it was minor, nothing really, in the grand scheme of the war, but it meant everything to him at that moment. Because it was proof to Luffy that Garp had still cared, in his own twisted, absent fashion. And for a boy who had spent years seeking out familial affection, it was all-consuming. That there was still a chance for his grandfather. For Ace. Luffy shot up, with renewed vigor, and blurted out, 10 years from now. Garp stopped him with an abrupt wave of his hand. "Don't bother. I don't know the specifics of time travel, but I wouldn't waste your breath." Garp stood, stretching out his limbs. An uncomfortable crack resounded. "I'm not interested in the future." Luffy frowned. But, he trailed off. If anyone had the power to change Ace's fate, it was Garp. If only the stubborn old man would listen. "I don't know how you ended up here, but it would do you some good if you thought about your actions." Garp was scowling. "Don't mess with the past, brat. It always comes back to bite you in the butt." "What do you mean?" Garp leveled him with an unimpressed glower. A life for a life, and for a moment, Luffy had the distinct impression that Garp understood what Luffy had tried to say. Perhaps he was always aware of the inevitable fate of his grandson. Or not. He was a difficult man to read. "That's the cost, remember that." He rolled his shoulders. "Now, want to tell me why you're hiding in here like a kicked puppy?" The sudden topic change startled Luffy from his musings. A life for a life? Luffy stiffened on instinct, having not expected the conversation to come full circle. Truthfully, he had no real reason as to why he hid from his brothers. Perhaps it was because he could not bear the thought of saying goodbye again. For as much as he missed his crew, he missed Ace so much. And leaving him behind did not settle well with his stomach. Luffy watched Garp, standing near the door, the only escape exit, barring the window behind Luffy. With enough force, the thing would surely give if the situation turned dire. Not that Luffy thought it would, but his grandfather was rather unpredictable. He voiced his concerns, unafraid of the judgment he might receive. Luffy did not feel shame often. He didn't see the point in it. "How do you say goodbye?" A flicker of grief shone in Garp's eyes, only to vanish within the next second, swept up by the gentle draft of the room. "Goodbye? Is this what this is about?" Garp huffed. "I didn't raise a coward." Luffy did not rise to the bait, waiting with remarkable patience for the old man's answer. Finally, it came in the way of a reluctant exhale. "I don't know, kid. Not a big fan of them, myself. I didn't say goodbye to my greatest rival, not to my son, either. Frankly, they're useless. You either see each other again, or you don't. Nothing good about leaving someone behind." And Luffy could understand that. He, too, had never seen the point of saying goodbye when there was always a chance of another meeting. But where Luffy was returning, he knew that the only appearance of his brothers, the ones of his past, were the ghosts of his memories. "So, I shouldn't say goodbye?" Garp snorted. "Who says you'll get the chance to? Time is fickle." He cracked his knuckles. "Now, is that all that's bothering you? 'Cause I have some training sessions to attend and the monkeys." Luffy's eyes brightened. "Can I join?" Garp's rewarding smirk was dangerous. Miraculously, the sky had cleared up only a couple of hours later, and Luffy attributed it to his good luck that it did. After all, he wouldn't have gotten the chance to do this if it hadn't. "You're going to kill us?" Sabo exclaimed, dancing around a boulder thrown his way. courtesy of Luffy. Nope. He laughed, watching as Ace darted beneath a log, hurled by Garp's expert aim. Sabo and Ace's teamwork was impressive. The way they moved together was brought upon by years of fighting together. They never bumped into each other and had a talent for being aware of where the other was. This much was apparent as Sabo pushed Ace out of the way of a rock, without so much as sparing a glance at the older boy. Ace took the stumbling in stride, pivoting to the left to avoid the strike of a malevolent monkey and rushing towards his grandfather, with a pipe raised high to bring down on the old man's head. It never landed. A kick to his gut blew Ace away as Garp's responding chortle thundered in the clearing. Ace huffed. "Holy sheet" escaped his lips as he spotted the monkey that Luffy had flung his way and danced back just in time to feel the animal's feet brush against the hair on his chin. He heaved, clutching at his midriff. "You're insane," he declared, joining Sabo, back to back as they fended off the approaching cluster of monkeys. They were ready to pounce and devour, judging by their gaping maws with canines prone to cutting. "Kick Luffy supplied with glee, happy to be on the other side of training for once. And even after being trained under Silver's Rayleigh, he would still consider Garp's training methods to be the worst. They were grueling and tedious, the various nights spent at the bottom of a ravine, evidence of that. "This is fun." He earned a biting glare from Ace and Sabo. "Time out," Sabo cried out as he practically collapsed to the grass beneath, his little limbs giving out to exhaustion. Coincidentally, he had missed the large stick pelted over his head. "What, no way?" Luffy cried out immediately, but Garp was accepting of Sabo's pleas. He was growing tired, too. With the countless hours they had spent in this same clearing, his weary muscles did not have the same energy as before. Even if he could still run laps around most marine vice-admirals. Ace scoffed, swiping away the sweat that had begun to build along his brow. Garp stood from his crouched position and shooed away the monkeys. The animals followed his command as though they were hired to do so, and Luffy didn't disagree with the thought. Maybe they were related. "Enough complaining, brats. Luffy, take em away from here before I decide it's time for another impromptu camping trip with Grandpa." In tandem, Luffy and Ace shivered. Luffy made quick work of scooping up his brothers and hauling them over his shoulders, like sacks of flour. Ace protested the action, but it fell on deaf ears and also rubber skin, as Ace smacked Luffy repeatedly. Their warmth against his skin was refreshing, and Luffy basked in it. Instead of taking them back to their treehouse, he began the hazardous trek down Mt. Corvo, to where Windmill Village sat idle. The name was evidently fitting, as the towering structures with twisting blades enveloped the village. The surrounding area was fields of wheat, with the occasional path formed between for the random passerby, like Luffy. It was over an hour later that they had ventured completely down from Mt. Corvo, and had waded through the winding hills of wheat, to where the path connected to the sandy beaches of Goa Kingdom. "Why are we here?" Sabo's voice sliced through the silence of the trio, as he gave a worried glance to the sea. "Why not?" Luffy dropped them to the ground, rejoicing in the twin groans of pain he garnered. "It's a great day to swim." Ace leveled him with a glare, as though to say, "Really? Luffy, you can't swim. You have a devil fruit." Luffy giggled. "I know, but Ace and Sabo are here." With that, he bounded towards the lapping waves of the sea and fell forward, embracing the icy clutch of the sea. He ignored the distressed calls from his brothers, as the water engulfed him and drew him further out from shore, until he began sinking, and sinking oddly reminiscent of the time that Bandit had thrown him into the water all those years ago. Barring the lack of thrashing and panic just as his head was about to go under, his body powerless to fight the enticing pull of the current, two sets of arms grabbed him and pulled him up. His head slumped, but he had a relaxed smile on his features as though he wasn't bathed in his literal weakness. "You idiot!" Ace exclaimed, dragging him to the more shallow ends of the water. For a moment, Luffy felt confusion. Why was Ace mad? They had done this countless times before. Then it struck him. It wasn't until Sabo died that they started venturing to the sea and swimming, or, in Luffy's case, being dragged along the water by Ace. He sighed, a slight pout to his lip as he allowed himself to be hauled over to the water and dropped to the ground unceremoniously. The water was up to his knees, zapping him of his energy, but he was in no danger. This seemed to satisfy his brothers as they let out twin sighs of accomplishment. Luffy stared at the cotton candy blue of the sky, the cirrus clouds wafting across it and occasionally impeding the blinding rays of the sun. Just hours ago, it had been engulfed by thick, gray clouds, like the sky had been openly weeping across the land in mourning. But now it sang with wind and water, into a symphony as old as the concept of time. Perhaps even older. The melody of it was coaxing, a promise of sunny days forever, with nothing but rainbows glimpsing the skies after a particularly dreadful night. It was as close to paradise as one could get in the East Blue and as far away as they were to the Grandline. But as the saying went, the warmer the day, the colder the night. And frigid was it, huddled up close beneath a canopy of leaves. Hours later, water cascading down the slope of Luffy's cheeks as he made good on his promise to tell them stories of his adventures. A promise made without any forethought for what that meant for the future. He was far too caught up in the novelty of enjoying the beach with his brothers than to focus on the promise that had slipped from his mouth like breathing. It was invigorating, playing beside his brothers like the old days. Luffy felt life thrumming through his veins, and as the sun fell below the horizon line, it only served to keep him pushing with strength as he carried his brothers back up the mountain. They were beat. From training, to their spontaneous decision to go frolicking in the shallow waters, they hadn't even protested Luffy's wiry arms winding around them and carrying them back home. Now, they sat near the fire, the flames crackling to life, a mirror image of Ace and Sabo's power. Warmth, safety, love. Luffy relished in it even as the life in his veins waned and foreboding began to tingle up his spine. Ace and Sabo were knocked out against his sides, snoring lightly and bundled tight with spare blankets, and Luffy took the moment to watch them. The rise and fall of their chests, the cheeks still lined with baby fat, the slight twitch of their eyelashes, as they presumably dreamed. Their hair, still wet but in the process of drying, stuck to their skin. Luffy itched to move the hair out of their faces, to memorize each intricate part of their face, for his time was coming to an end. He knew it was. Perhaps it was paranoia. But Luffy thought differently. He suspected it had something to do with his observation haki. He could feel the ebbing of the devil fruit's power. Time was grasping him with tendril-like appendages and pulling ready to drag him back to where he belonged. It was only a matter of hours, or realistically, minutes. He could not resist the enticing draw of time's palms, just as he could not deny the sea's almost siren-like call. Doomed, regardless. Luffy freed his hand from under the weight of a woolly blanket and caressed Ace's supple cheek, the touch brisk so as not to wake his older brother. His skin was soft, with freckles dotted across his tan skin. A part of Luffy did not want to return, did not want to leave behind the heat of Ace and Sabo's bodies against his. For a time, their love was all he had known. They had filled the gaping chasm in his heart as a child, the parts that shouldn't have been empty as a child but were. The parts of him that yearned for a family, people to call his own, and they gave him that. They never abandoned him. But now, he would leave them, let them suffer the fate of their future, with only vague warnings, and it felt wrong. But Luffy had no way of knowing if sharing anything would change their fate, as Robin had said all those weeks ago. Time could very well be a fixed thing, something that did not bend to meddling hands. Maybe it was all inescapable. Luffy didn't know. But for now, he knew one thing: he had little choice whether he could stay or not. He could feel it taking hold and pulling. Now would be about the time to start tallying the minutes, as short as they were. With the remaining strength in his arms, it was weakening. He felt dizzy. Was that normal? He shoved his brothers awake, desperate for a goodbye to what would only exist in his memories from then on. Luffy was selfish, and therefore he could never choose between his brothers and his crew. But for a moment, he let hope envelope his limbs and his words. Maybe he had done right, and Ace would live. As they blinked awake, dazed and bemused, he found the strength to speak. Ace, Sabo. His words soared with the pure adoration in his heart, the accumulation of a decade's worth of loving his brothers with the entirety of his heart. Look after each other, okay? His tongue felt far too heavy to say more, even as his heart practically exploded with unsaid words. I love you, please, please live this time, don't die on me, again. With his last words and their widening eyes as realization dawned on them, he felt a halo of light encompass his body and drag him into an abyss of nothing and everything at the same time. The last image to accompany him along his train home was the dimming image of his brothers' outstretched hands as they called for him to stay. There was a certain poetic touch to it, that it would be Luffy leaving them behind, this time around. He awoke in an unfamiliar bed. With his abrupt consciousness, came the whirling of his gut as though a storm had formed in his stomach, and he promptly threw up over the side of the bed. He blinked with the back of his hand. Luffy wiped at his mouth and spared a glance around the small room he had awoken in. It was closet-sized and barren of light, and smelling distinctly of barf, thanks to Luffy. He cringed, standing from the bed with wobbly knees as he made a break for the door. It was wood and gave way under the tiniest amount of pressure. He poured into a hall, curiously familiar but unnameable in his wide range of memories. It was lit by the gentle glow of candles along the monotonous walls. By the sway of the floor beneath him, he was on a ship. But not the Thousand Sunny. He frowned. Stumbling down the hall, he came across a set of stairs leading up to a door. The boat was devoid of life, or maybe his senses hadn't come back to him fully. There was an absence of sound. No, that wasn't right. There was buzzing, high and aggravating in his ears. But it was mellowing the more Luffy blindly walked around and searched for the occupants of the ship. He found no one below deck. Finally, he resigned himself to climbing the steps. His thoughts were startlingly empty, despite the lingering memories of his brothers as children at the edge of his mind. He knew it was real, and far from a dream. His dreams had never been able to replicate the sheer heat that Ace and Sabo's bodies emanated, or the fondness that swirled in their eyes when they peered at him. It was real, he told himself, as he opened the door and was greeted by several sets of eyes, boring into him in an instant. His gaze traveled across familiar faces, his mind cataloging their features and names, one by one until it came to an abrupt halt upon realizing just whose ship he was on. Those were the red-haired pirates. And his crew and Sabo? What? His mind was far too fatigued for this. A chorus of sound reverberated across the deck as everyone met the same conclusion. The first to move was a reindeer, who burst from the cluster of people and cried out, "Luffy!" He was sobbing as he engulfed Luffy's legs in a tight embrace. "Why, you're back." Chopper could not take his eyes off of his captain, the pure, unfiltered love that consumed his words enough to make Luffy buckle and drop to his knees so that he could return his doctor's hug. "I was so worried." Nami was the next to clash against him, her wiry arms encircling him, as her cheek squished against the top of his head. "Luffy, oh my god. You're back." The rest of his crew was not far behind the navigator, as they all took turns sharing Luffy around in hugs, all except Zoro, who watched him with a patient but amused expression. He was hardly surprised by Luffy's sudden arrival, evidently. They all repeated the same words, a blend of, "I miss you," to, "holy sheet," or declarations of death if he were to ever disappear again. Luffy took it all in stride, relishing in the physical closeness of his crew even as exhaustion clung to his frame. It got to the point of Chopper noticing, and he promptly switched to doctor mode at a glimpse of something amiss with Luffy. "Are you injured?" He darted around Luffy, inspecting him for wounds as he began listing off question after question, most of which Luffy hardly followed. But he smiled, all the same. He had missed his crew so much. "Chopper," Robin stopped him, with a tentative smile, "he's just returned from a trip to the past. It's best to assume he is fatigued." Chopper gasped. "Right. Sanji, light food only." There he was, going off and creating a diet for Luffy's next month, much to Luffy's ire. "Little meat, really? No way." Sanji listened with rapt attention, and Luffy did not bother biting back his whine of protest. There was no way. Luffy's eyes caught on a familiar head of red, and he froze. His mind supplied the name of which he was currently in denial of, Shanks. Shanks was here, within hugging distance, for Luffy, and this was totally breaking their promise. Oh no. Zoro, who had remained mostly silent throughout their reunion, caught his tension and jostled his shoulder with his own. "Don't worry. We'll be out of here soon, since you're back." Despite the obvious intention to bring him comfort, it merely left Luffy adrift amid his confusing swirl of emotions sparking to life within him. He had left the past and with it, the ghosts of it, or so he thought. Before him, standing behind the horde of people crowding in front of him, was Shanks. Tall, broad-shouldered, one arm less and a shaky smile upon his aged features. He could not meet Luffy's gaze, boring into him as it was. He seemed to stare anywhere but Luffy, above him, behind him, at Zoro, but never Luffy. Luffy could almost call it fear, if he had not known Shanks better. Yet, he had no name for the emotion fixed upon his idol's face. Someone tugged at his sleeve, and to his surprise, it was red. Like the sleeve of his cardigan. Last he had checked, he had been wearing a borrowed Hawaiian button-up. Odd. Luffy? Chopper, with his round eyes framed by tufts of brown fur. He was staring up at Luffy, eyes wide and unbelieving of the sight of his captain, before him and alive the proper age, this time. "Are you okay?" With his question, the deck fell into an eerie silence, like everyone was waiting on whatever answer Luffy might give. He didn't get it. "Yeah, I'm fine." Perhaps fine was not the correct word to convey the wide variety of emotions flowing through Luffy. But as it stood, it was not in Luffy's character to discuss emotions. Not because he was averse to it, like Zoro, but only that he rarely felt the need to. There were very few times in Luffy's life that he had experienced complete devastation, and each time it had happened, those emotions had taken a backseat because there was always something more important to focus on. And right now, that was the fact that he was on the Red Force, again, in the present, and Shanks was in front of him. In reaching distance. He could not quite comprehend the thought, his mind short-circuiting at the prospect of a conversation with Shanks, even if that broke their very promise, sworn all those years ago. Sanji stepped forward, smooth and lax, like all was well. He thumbed his cigarette idly. "So, what now, Captain? Set sail?" Evidently, no one, besides Zoro, was willing to address the elephant in the room, the elephant being the other emperor on board. Robin pet her head. "It's only a matter of time until the world government catches wind of our," she trailed off, "temporary alliance." She eyed Luffy, unblinking, much like a wise owl. Luffy's gaze had yet to leave Shanks, and it was growing increasingly difficult for the redhead to evade Luffy's stare. "I'm hungry," he said, breathless. And his crew understood him, just as he had expected them to. "I'm sure I can cook up something quick." Sanji spared a glance down at Chopper, who remained clinging to Luffy's jorts. "Of course, it'll be light." Chopper is right. "You need to take it easy." "Yeah, no kidding. A trip to the past cannot be healthy." Nami snorted, effectively cutting the tension that had begun to build. She inclined her head to Robin. "Right?" Like always, the crew turned to Robin, at any given chance, for an answer to something mystifying. Robin smiled, that serene one, telling of how happy she was to bask in the presence of her family, whole and together, as it should be. "I cannot say. I've never been to the past myself. But it's best to assume that it is taxing on the body." Luffy should follow Chopper's directions. Like her word was law, the Straw Hats, in tandem, turned on Luffy and ushered him towards the Thousand Sunny, which was anchored beside the Red Force. Luffy lightly protested at their manhandling, gentle as it was. He was not a baby. They did not seem to get the message. "Wait." That voice. Luffy could never forget the suave drawl of it. Masculine in nature and tainted by desperation, Luffy could instinctively place the sound of it as Shanks. The only man that ever came close to resembling a father in Luffy's life. Luffy whirled on him, instinctively, twisting in the grasp of Jinbei, whose grip loosened at the abruptness. "I'm sure Lucky Roo won't mind if you use his kitchen," Shanks said, his eyes finally landing on Luffy. Luffy was many things selfish, kind as a product of that selfishness, a pirate who sought liberation through sailing the seas and obtuse, but he was not oblivious. He understood the underlying message of Shanks' words. Therefore, Sabo stepped forward, and Luffy jumped at the movement, having not fully registered Sabo's presence until then. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" And of course, Sabo would know best of anyone present barring Luffy and Shanks how much their promise meant to Luffy. Luffy stretched his hand out, grasping his brother's wrist and holding tight, ensuring that they could never split apart. There had been too many times of separation between the brothers. Luffy was not willing to let go this time around. "I'm sure," Luffy said, finding that his strength was leisurely coming back to him, minute by minute. With Luffy's assurance, his crew relaxed and Sabo retreated to his brother's side, his blue eyes icy, similar to the frigid wafts of winds that foretold the arrival of winter. They were apologetic and warming by the second. Luffy squeezed his wrist. Frankie clapped, dispelling the awkward air with the action. "Super. I am starving, bro. What's on the menu tonight?" Like that, the people aboard the deck began to disperse into mini-groups. Some went below deck, following Sanji and Lucky Roo into the galley. Others remained on deck, chattering. The buzz of people was familiar and Luffy embraced it, sticking close to the warmth of Jinbei and Sabo, who remained at his side with not so much as a request from Luffy. He didn't complain about it, however. Their tiny cluster of people, near the railing, consisted of a meager 4 people: Luffy, Sabo, Robin, and Jinbei. All of them hovered over Luffy like he was fragile. He scowled. "So," Sabo started, wincing at how his voice broke the quiet of the group. "The past?" He blinked down at Luffy, curious. Luffy's frown deepened. "You don't remember?" Granted, he hadn't seen much point in attempting to change Sabo's future. He had ended up alive, after all, and with a purpose. A group of people to call his. And Luffy wasn't selfish enough to take that away from him. "Remember?" Sabo echoed, eyebrows twisting together. "Luffy, where exactly did you end up?" 3 heavy stares fell on him, waiting, and Luffy drooped against Jinbei. Robin spoke first, as she rubbed her chin thoughtfully. "It's safe to assume he was sent back 12 years, as was my theory. I'm correct to surmise that those dates would match up with the time you knew Luffy as a child?" Sabo nodded. "Then Luffy has interacted with your past self." "That is the obvious conclusion." She eyed Luffy, a mixture of sympathy and understanding on her face. "And likely a past version of Ace. Tell me, Luffy, did you?" Luffy blinked. At their imploring gazes, Luffy found his voice. "I warned Ace." Despite the reluctant way in which he spoke, he did not regret his actions. Any chance of saving his brother was one that should be taken, regardless of the consequences. Sabo sighed, but to the credit of the people encircling Luffy, they hardly appeared surprised. Nor vexed. If anything, they were resigned to this outcome. "Is he?" A pinched expression broke across Sabo's sullen features, and Luffy understood it well enough. His brief visit to the past had had little effect on the present. Maybe, if Luffy had given Ace more information, he could have changed the outcome of Marineford or, better yet, avoided the altercation altogether. His thoughts of maybes and what-ifs were useless now. And with Sabo's dimming response, Luffy fell deeper into Jinbei's arms. "No," Sabo muttered. 2 years ago, tears would have sprung into existence at the confession. But Luffy was stronger now. Even if the wound of Ace's passing was still raw, he was most thankful to be afforded those last moments with his brothers. And by extension, Dayton, Makino and his grandfather. Short as they were, they offered something Luffy could not grasp in the present, closure. For that, Luffy would hold the highest of gratitude to the stolen moments, where he heard his brothers' childish voices, unburdened and filled with mirth. It was a gift, even as it tore his heart and formed a new chasm of longing. He accepted its presence, as Jinbei's arms enveloped him and squeezed, offering a semblance of comfort as Luffy fell into a pit of distant memories, far off from the horizon. And the present. Dinner was an eventful affair. And by eventful, Luffy meant it was teeming with laughter and boisterous voices. Expected, as Shanks' crew had only grown in size since the last time Luffy had bid them farewell. And mixed with Luffy's own crew well, the dining room had never seen such energy. Luffy, who was called over to sit at the commander's table, was enthusiastic. It was as though over a decade's worth of time had never passed. They joked freely with Luffy and, in turn, as did Luffy. Lucky Roo was quick to fill him in on their latest escapades, and while some Luffy had heard in passing, through the recounting of Nami's weekly news coup papers, others were brand new and left sparkles in Luffy's eyes. Throughout their conversation, Shanks remained silent, observing with a smile tugging at his lips at every booming giggle that escaped Luffy. It felt like no time had passed, and for both Shanks and Luffy that was the case. For one of them had ventured to the past and had only met shadows of what once was. The other was faced with his life's greatest regret in the form of a boy he thought long gone, something he had mistakenly thought was buried in his memories. And even though they shared no words, they were content to bask in each other's presence. Or so Shanks thought. It was after the joyous dinner shared amongst the two crews that Shanks had wandered towards the railing, like he had done so much this past week. He watched and listened intently to the noise of a distant village and rocking waves, only for it to be interrupted by the echo of sandals slapping against wood. The telltale sound of a rubber boy eager and hasty to arrive at his destination, which so happened to be Shanks' side. Luffy stopped short of the railing and leaned over the side, blinking down at the sea in wonder. Shanks had half the mind to pull him back before he was pelted into the ocean by the unsteady movement of the boat. Luffy was uncharacteristically silent, perhaps, waiting for Shanks to breach the quiet that hung over them like the blade of an executioner. And even though it went against everything within him, Shanks was shamelessly powerless to Luffy's unvoiced request. How was the past? He winced. The first time they had talked in 12 years, and that was what he decided on? Luffy shifted, peering up at him with those wide eyes of his round, supple cheeks and a too bright grin. Far too similar to his child self, if only a bit older. He was certainly taller and with more muscle, less the lanky child he had been a mere day ago. Or 12 years ago. Shanks didn't know time travel was far too confusing a concept to grasp. His hair was longer, but still tousled the same. The scar was identical if only healed over, old, telling of the years that had passed since Luffy had inflicted himself with the wound. Ace is so small, Luffy said, wistful. Sabo's hair was still growing out. Shanks blinked at the confession. He pet his head in thought, racking his brain for a response. He settled on something simple, coaxing the boy beside him to continue, if only so he could hear his voice for a little longer. Oh, yeah? MHM. I didn't remember Ace smiling much when we were kids, but, Luffy trailed off, a fond grin overtaking his face as he reminisced. He smiled. Luffy's hands clutched at the railing like they were a lifeline. I took them to the beach, and they saved me, just like back when we were kids. His soft features contorted, twisting into something akin to downtrodden. I miss them, Shanks. With his only arm, he reached forward and draped it along Luffy's shoulder and pulled him close, until he was flush against Shanks' flank. I know, kid, I know. He pulled Luffy's head close, and he fit just as he had as a child, under Shanks' chin. Shanks was not Luffy's father, but by everything holy and wicked in this world, Luffy fit so well in Shanks' arm, that there was no way he could be anyone else's but Shanks' son. A soft gasp, raspy, but familiar to Shanks, who had only ever known Luffy as a crybaby. I missed you too. Was the low confession that broke Shanks' heart to smithereens, melting the glue that held the cracks together all these years. It was another type of grief to say goodbye to someone who was alive but out of one's reach. This, both Shanks and Luffy learnt the hard way. Me too, kid. He couldn't bring himself to utter Luffy's name, or it would make all of this too real, and with it, would bring the nauseating, swirling ball of his feelings he had long since attempted to bury in the ocean of the East Blue. Something that he could not afford as they neared the ultimate act of Luffy's adventure, and thus Shanks' conclusion. Night fell upon the thousand sunny, darkness encompassing the sky as Luffy gazed wordlessly up at the sea of blinking stars. Wisps of cirrus clouds drifted across the fathomless sky, aimlessly gliding past the full moon, center amid the backdrop of pitch black. Tranquil was the first night back from his dip into the past, without sound, barring the muted music of mellifluous violin courtesy of Brook. The melody engulfed the shushed sea, it lurked in the background of Luffy's consciousness, the familiar tune of it like a cocoon of warmth, enveloping him and encouraging him to succumb to the edges of slumber that overtook his vision. But as peaceful as the music was, they could not tame the rampant sprint of his thoughts. Akin to the feral way in which a pack of wolves dashed after prey, his thoughts chased away the lingering comfort. Rather, they reminded him of his losses. His efforts, however minimal they were all for nothing, and Luffy could both comprehend this thought and not. A part of him knew it was too good to be true, that he would be given this chance to save his brother from a cruel fate at the hands of a nobody devil fruit user. That fate was not merciful, and by his grandfather's words, it was fickle. There was a lesson to be learned here, one that Luffy did not particularly care for. Not when he had had his brothers in his hands once more and he had been the one to abandon them this time around. A lesser person would claim that Luffy had no choice in the matter, that his body was weakening as time intended on dragging him back kicking and screaming, an unwilling victim of their charades. But to Luffy, that was not the case. He could have told Ace more, pushed Garp more, anything. Perhaps the brief memories made during his time in the past offered a semblance of closure, but Luffy could not shake off the festering wound of his heart. And how it was rubbed raw, the chasm of his heart left gaping upon the moment his eyes landed on his older brother, 10, alive and smiling. And maybe his shortly lived visit was doomed from the start, as Robin had said, that time was a fixed thing. It did nothing to quell the loneliness beginning to creep at the corners of him, the intensity familiar to him. His childhood was nothing but the aching absence of love. Until he had met Shanks, Ace and Sabo. And then Dayton and Makino. And then his crew, all of them, having made places in his very being. His most coveted treasure, in a world teeming with heaps of gold and various riches. That's what he should be focusing on, he told himself. It did little to help his heart that bled with love, that had no place to go but to a grave located somewhere in the new world. What are you thinking about? A voice called, the distinct sound of grass crunching beneath boots reaching Luffy's ears first. His observation hockey was still wonky, disorientated thanks to a mini-adventure with time travel. Luffy peered up. Lying down as he was able to glimpse a head of blonde, before a body settled next to his. The warmth of it was coaxing, drawing him in. So, Luffy gave in. Because it was Sabo, Luffy answered honestly. Ace. A hitch of breath was the only response he garnered. He was happy, Sabo. To anyone else that had met Ace, the statement would seem odd. Ace was a charismatic guy, full of mischievous joy. But to Luffy and Sabo, who knew Ace like the back of their hands, who could map out the dots of his freckles in the stars, they had never thought of their brother, the child version, as happy. He had always been snide remarks, cocky smirks and a vague sense of loathing in his eyes. Of course, he cared, he loved them. This was something the brothers never doubted. But he wasn't affectionate, not until he was older and had found a passion, something which Sabo had never had the chance to experience. So, Sabo could not help but be surprised at Luffy's confession. Happy? He echoed, breathless. Just as it did every time he recalled his childhood, his scar throbbed. A phantom ache, really, but present, nonetheless, as he cuddled with his brother. Luffy hummed. Yeah. I don't think I ever noticed that Ace was happy. But it's nice. That they had given Ace that joy. To Luffy, Ace and Sabo deserved everything and more, and among that lengthy list of things they were owed, was a simple idea, love. And they had it in plenty. Much to the feigned ire of their childhood selves. Sabo's fingers twitched from their position against Luffy's midriff, contemplative. I remember. Ace being angry, a lot. Faint as his memories were, he made time in his life to cycle through them, to relive them even if the sense, and the sounds of voices faded by virtue of time passing. Sabo was persistent in recalling the minuscule details. Like the scars along Ace's palms, or Luffy's delightful giggles. And the broader things, the winter they spent hunkered in their treehouse, a sunset of dazzling colors not unlike the flames of the Mera Mera no Mi. He wanted to memorize each detail, not willing to let it escape him again. It was far too precious for him to ever let go of. Not for the second time. He didn't trust easily. Sabo snorted, he hated me on sight. Luffy glanced at him, curious. Ace hated Sabo? A chuckle from deep within the blonde escaped, and he did nothing to stifle the laughter. Did he ever? He thought I was some no-good gray terminal thief. He was right, of course, but it's the principle of the matter, you know. Luffy joined him in his amusement, with his high giggles, and Sabo relished in the noise, as it consumed the surrounding air. Brook's music had long since tapered off. Anyway, a couple good heists and he eventually let me in. Well, as in as Ace could. I never got to steal stuff with you guys. Luffy pouted and Sabo bit down on the smile that tugged at his lips. You stole ramen, Sabo said, if only to tease his brother. It worked, Luffy rising to the bait like a fish to a worm. Huffing, Luffy weakly swatted at Sabo. Food, that's different. You guys got to go and steal money. Right, for their pirate stash. The same money that had Luffy strung up and at the mercy of vicious criminals. He shivered at the thought, the lingering rage sitting idle in his gut. You would have got us caught. Sabo did not bother listening to Luffy's protests. They were both aware of the truth, despite Luffy's denials. Luffy did not do stealth. Shouldn't you be resting? Like clockwork, Luffy groaned. I'm not tired. Sabo chortled, doctor's orders. He abruptly stood, lifting his little brother with him. You sleep in the men's quarters, right? Luffy nodded, blinking up at Sabo, as he lazed boneless in his older brother's arms. Typical. Sabo sauntered towards where he knew the door to the men's chambers was located, quiet as he unlocked the door and poured in. Snores reverberated in the room. Zoro woke with a start, as soon as the door had been opened, but once his sleep-ridden mind gleaned that it was merely Sabo and Luffy, he fell to the carpet and returned to his coma. His snores were the loudest amongst the crew, Sabo noted. A free hammock swung leisurely and Sabo dropped his brother unceremoniously down on the thick fabric, settling the quilt over his body with careful ministrations. Now was better than never, he decided, as he caught Luffy's eyes slipping shut. I'll be leaving tonight. Luffy attempted to rise, alert at Sabo's words, but Sabo pushed him back down. Shoo, you'll wake up your crew. I have to get back to the army. He frowned, his gloved hand seeking out the downy touch of his brother's tousled hair. He twirled a strand around his finger. I'm sorry I can't stay longer. I'll try to visit more, 'kay? Just. Sabo, Luffy murmured, with a croaky voice. Please stay tonight. As though no time had passed between the 7-year-old image of Luffy and the 19-year-old version of Luffy, he fell back into his crybaby ways. And amongst the three devoted brothers, Sabo was utterly weak to the effects of tears welling up at the corners of Luffy's eyes. Okay. Tonight. Luffy shuffled in his hammock, making space for his brother, and Sabo accepted the silent invite, climbing in as he kicked off his boots and discarded his coat. It was surely hazardous, but Sabo was uncaring of the consequences, as he settled next to his brother and was encircled by rubbery limbs. Tonight, three brothers would remain reunited beneath the blanket of darkness, in the form of two bodies, and the flames within Sabo's heart. Tomorrow, Luffy would say goodbye to Shanks and Sabo, and set sail with his crew, again, unaware of the events that would transpire in the future but content with the glimpses of his brothers, now long lost to history. But, tonight, three brothers would huddle close, reminiscent of their childhood.
Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.